what you did, you little jerk.
What's going on, jerk faces? Welcome to a new episode of the Circle of Jerks podcast. And we got, as always, we got our trusty editor, Andy, in our third chair. And then we have our...
It's more like God.
Yeah, okay.
Oh, God. Yes.
I know, right? Exactly. I mean, it's not that far off because, I do handle pretty much everything.
That is true.
So.
I'm just a pretty face
segue.
behind the camera.
It's a funny segue at the beginning because that has to do with our topic of discussion today.
Right. And we have a returning member who is our guest today, Dan Genud, who we're going to be talking to. He's a guy that I've known essentially my entire life. We've been best friends since...
Over 25 years now.
Yeah,
Yep.
since pretty much the time we met. We've been best friends,
Yep.
and we've gone through a lot of changes in life together, but we've stuck it out, and man, what a great guy. We're going to learn a little bit about how we met, a little bit about his life, and might be a little bit kind of theological today. We're going to have, what's that movie that you're...
Keeping the faith.
Yeah, keeping the faith. It's going to be a little bit like that, where we obviously are. I'm not a Jew, but I am.
For the right money, he will be.
Yeah.
And with that statement, you're in. Welcome
Yeah.
to the tribe for the both of you.
So we're talking a little bit about that, how Dan became a Jew, and kind of some of the nuances from his side of the aisle, and a little bit of comparing and contrasting some of the stuff. So for those of you who are a little bit curious about what the hell people believe in, well, you came to the right episode. So let's get this party started. Well, Dan, how you doing? We haven't seen you in about a year.
It's good to be back. Yeah, I've taken a year-plus hiatus from the Circle of Jerks, and I'm happy to be back. I won't say jerking off, but hey. In the circle.
Yeah, someplace somewhere, James is going like, "Oh my God!"
Yeah,
like,
I know. And it's because of jokes like that where I'm like, I'm so happy I came up with that name.
Welcome to the party. I'm so happy to be back.
Well, the best part about that was because James had no idea that was kind of the play on words that we were going for, and he was like, when he was promoting the show, his friends were like, "Wait, that sounds a lot like this. Do you know what that is?" Like, "Oh my God! Like, do you guys know what this means?"
James
like,
he had no idea.
Yeah,
he had
it's
no
like
idea.
That's hilarious.
Because it's twofold. Like, and I think we talked about this the last episode too, because people asked. But yeah, it was kind of the everyone's saying that we're all yes men, we all agree with each other. Kind of a circle jerking. But then there's the horrible real sex HBO thing people that's sitting around.
It's a conversation that I get to have with all the staff at the camp. I work at a summer camp yearly as part of the year-round staff, and obviously over the summer we all move up. It's a residential camp. And so, yes, we have to have that very fun conversation of watch those boys in their own tents, because if anything that you can imagine, they will try.
Oh, Lord.
And so that
nothing like
watch the circle jerks.
Yeah, nothing.
Watch them. No, watch out for them.
Yeah.
Nothing like the sound of rapidly moving polyester.
Exactly.
Oh, Lordy.
You know when it's quiet in the kids' cabins, that means it's too quiet for a reason.
It's like...
I know, you start hearing... It's like, oh, Jesus.
I'm coming in. Cut it out, whatever you're doing in there.
Now watch your eyes.
No, watch your eyes. That was a great joke. Not in my eye, Papa Smurf.
Anyways, so Dan, why don't you share with our group of how we ended up meeting, and we'll start with that. How did we end up becoming friends?
So I'm a native Philadelphian, but I moved out here to LA when I was about 5, and the next year when I started kindergarten, we happened to be fortunate enough to be starting at the same school, Kester Elementary. And it was really one of those funny things that pretty much from the start, from day 1 or so, we ended up eating lunch next to each other as I think I can safely say easily the two smallest kids in the
Oh,
class. We were both
easily.
really always small for our age.
Yeah.
You know, skinny, short.
I was also a
kids.
year younger than everybody in that class too.
That's right. That's right.
Because
You're on the
I
younger
never
end
went to
of
preschool, so my mom just said, "No, you're not going to preschool. You're just going to go to kindergarten."
Right. You're on the younger end of the spectrum, and even of the cohort for that age. And even though I'm slightly on the older end, I waited a year to go to
Right. It was
kindergarten.
the weird rules that they have for like the age like cutoffs and
Yeah.
stuff. It was you were just past it, so you had to wait a whole another year. And
You
me,
just made
I
it.
just made it in, so it's like, oh yeah. And
Right.
that's
Yes, I mean, same with us. Because same with me. Because me and Robert share the same birthday. So
That's right. You're both October 4th.
Right.
Yeah.
yeah. So I was always the youngest in my
Your
year.
grade. Yep.
Dan, could you do me a favor and at least point the microphone more towards? No, just like angle it more towards. Yeah.
Down a little bit.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah,
Better. You can hear me
yeah.
better.
Much
A
better,
lot
yeah.
Okay.
Cool. So yeah, that's kind of the short story of how we met. I remember those lunches that we had. It was you had I think I had a drink or something that you liked,
And I
you
always had some type of cookie.
Yeah.
Probably an Oreo.
and
something
we
like that.
traded, and we ended up becoming fast friends
The rest
since
is
that
history.
point. Yeah.
That's how it happens with kindergarten, ladies and gentlemen. Sharing is caring. You can find a lifelong friend without realizing it.
Exactly.
Teach your kids to share.
And then then we ended up finding out that we had a lot in common. Like we all we liked a lot of the same things. We were both kind of bookish nerds that we read all the time.
Always have been.
And it just and the crazy thing is because normally like, oh, you're friends with someone in elementary school and then you leave elementary school and you never hear from that person again. And I'm very glad that it happened, but it's crazy that we stuck around as friends for so long. Because I, outside of like you and a few other friends that I've met through school, I don't talk to many people from that I went to school with anymore.
Yeah, I mean, same with that seems to be how it goes. You form these friendships in elementary school, and they don't tend to last very long, especially because kids move away, or they just like fall into like different groups or different interests, and I think to you guys it's a testament to how deep bond that you guys actually have.
Yeah.
Yep. Only through Facebook, some of these other social media sites, I've reconnected somewhat to some elementary school friends, but still, when I say reconnected, it might mean we chat once a year or so.
Yeah,
if
or like
that.
I'll like their pictures, they like my pictures.
Right. That's about as far as it goes. Have I
Right.
seen
Yeah,
any of these
as in,
people
like,
since elementary
reconnecting,
school?
quote
Yeah,
unquote.
right. Reconnecting, exactly.
Yeah. But we suck it out, and I literally see you every week.
Yep.
It's we're on a bowling team together, and we've been doing that for a number of years. But even before we did that, I mean, we were
hung
seeing
out
each other
on average once a week or so.
Yeah.
Just hanging out.
So that's kind of the story of how we met and why he's a jerk.
No
So
denying.
kind of something else that we also have in common that I wanted to talk about is we both have a passion for youth as far as kind of teaching the next generation. I do a lot with church and doing Bible teaching and kind of doing stuff with high school and junior high youth kids.
It's really good you followed up with that.
Yeah.
Well, no, I mean, just like because you said I have a passion for the youth, and it's like, and then you followed
That's
up.
yeah. I
That
knew where I was
good-
going.
Yeah,
Time
that's
in
this is
today's
Yeah.
2018. I have a passion for America's youth.
right, exactly.
Yeah, it could have been creepier. It's like I really like 12-year-olds.
Let's just
It always
get
could be
right
worse.
to the point.
It- yeah,
could
right.
always be
It
worse.
could always be
Remember
worse.
that, ladies
Yeah,
and
It
no.
could
gentlemen.
always be worse.
I had good intentions with that, but of course we had to drag it down to the gutter.
But
Thanks,
they
Andy.
always say the best laid intentions are dragged down to the gutter by Andy.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Isn't that
Sandy's
what saying
fault.
is? Yep.
But I am a Jew now, so.
That's right. You have to take
So
a
of course, it's
portion
always
of the
yeah.
blame.
I
Yeah.
always got to take a portion of the blame.
But anyways, so that it was kind of nice to find out that you also kind of have that same passion for teaching youth kids and kind of raising up the next generation in that sense. And I'm curious of how did you get into that? Like, what was your cause for wanting to go down that route?
Well, to put it simply, it has to do with my culture, my religion, which is Judaism. And the way I said it is a perfect example of how I feel and how a lot of Jews, especially American Jews, feel about Judaism, in that it's a culture and a race, if you want to call it that first, a nation, a peoplehood first, and then a religion second. And I think that's what makes Judaism unique and both, misunderstood at times and also kind of put on a pedestal at all the other times, in that it is one of the few, if not the only religion, certainly major religions, that really is thought of as a culture first. And that, the large percentage of today's Jews that are in Israel, as of 70 years ago when modern Israel was founded and refounded as a country, the Israelis, Israel is a secular country.
Right.
And,
yeah.
okay, and percentage-wise, I'll estimate around 80% of Israeli Jews are secular, are much more secular than even what we call the Reform American Jews, which means you're pretty much, Jewish by tradition, maybe by culture, by some of the customs you do, but you're not observant.
Right.
Okay, you're not religious,
Right,
you're
right.
not observant. Okay, and
And we'll break that down in a little bit.
Right, and then
Absolutely.
that goes to that saying, it's like, oh well, I'm culturally Jewish.
exactly, and that's not an insult at all. It's not I should say, sometimes it's taken as an insult by the questioner, especially if the questioner is not Jewish. It can sound like a defensive answer, but it's actually really both a traditional and a pride, a very proud way to answer what kind of Jew are you,
Right.
or that question. And so to answer your question more specifically about the youth, how did I get into teaching youth? Because it is one of the biggest pillars of Judaism, one of the most important commandments, and I'll say it that way because it is a commandment. In the Hebrew Bible, which we'll break down more specifically in a little while, think Old Testament, because Hebrew Bible is basically equivalent, synonymous with the Old Testament. One of the most important traditions and important commandments straight out of Deuteronomy, to be specific, is you shall teach them to your children. And the them are the commandments, the laws, the traditions,
Right.
the customs, okay, that you previously saw in the 5 books of Moses.
Right.
Okay, because
That
it's
Israel
Deuteronomy.
failed with many times.
Absolutely. And Israel was destroyed for about the nation of Jews in Israel, in their homeland, was wiped out, more or less, for 2,000 years, and we were spread to the winds. That's what they call the diaspora, meaning
Right.
we were dispersed throughout the entire world, kicked out of Israel in the 1st century AD, and only returned en masse in the 20th century.
Yeah. So, it leads me to the, next question is, for Christians, there's usually a point of because a lot of us are, converts from something, whether it be
Right.
we just, never really were a churchgoer, or, someone used to be a Buddhist or a Satanist or whatever you name it. And there was a moment in time where it's like there was the gospel message, and you heard it, and you believed, and you declared it. I don't know if there's something in that. Obviously, you've been culturally Jewish your whole life. Yeah, but is there a moment where, because there's a point where you're a Jew as far going to temple and all that, or the synagogue because your parents go. But then I assume that there is a point where you have to make that decision for yourself. That this is something I believe in. This is what I'm gonna do, and it's not because my parents went, so I'm just gonna go.
Right.
What is there? How did you become a Jew? As far as obviously you've always been a Jew, but as far as on the religious
Understood.
side,
And I'll answer that question first in general, because it's an important question and an important answer, and maybe one of the biggest differences between Judaism and Christianity, or Judaism and any other religion, but especially Christianity, is that most Jews, whether they are super Orthodox, very observant, very religious, in the middle, which I am, by the way, I consider myself a conservative Jew, and just very quickly, the conservative Jews are maybe rough comparison to your general Lutherans, Baptists,
the Protestant,
the general, right?
Yeah,
I would
okay.
say your mid-level Protestants, if there is such a term.
Yeah.
Okay. That's the conservative Jew equivalent. We're going to get more into that, I promise, in a little bit, the more specific denominations and factions and observance levels of Judaism. But for me, to answer your question, the short answer is no. And meaning there was not one point, maybe several points, but there certainly wasn't one point where I felt, really religiously, spiritually convinced, I'm Jewish. And part of that, and I think, I could be wrong, but I think that would be the general answer for the majority of Jews in the world, both America, Israel, and the rest of the world, just because it is so much taught from a young age that this is, a culture, not to say a culture first before religion, but the religion is part of the culture, not the other way around. And so there is no concept, really, in terms of Judaism, of being born again or finding your faith that I hear about, and has always fascinated me about both Protestants and Catholics, but about Christianity in general. And something that I think very few, if any, Jews can honestly say, I truly understand what it means to be born again, because there are percentage-wise, there are so very few converts to Judaism from any religion, or no religion for people who
I know it's pretty tough, right?
It's right. It's that's a whole nother topic, which maybe we'll get into more.
Well,
but in short, go ahead, Andy.
Oh no, I was gonna say because there's a I know I guess I'm gonna be the what is it, the comic relief for this episode, but it's just that constant joke about how Jews are great, salespeople, except for like when they're selling Judaism, because when someone like always comes to say, I was thinking about, or at least they come to a Jew and they go, I'm thinking about converting to Judaism, and they always go like, that's not that great.
Yep. It's like
pretty much.
Really?
No, there's all these.
You want to take all this suffering, and
you want to tack on all the guilt and all the all the obligation.
Why do we think this concept of Jewish humor is such a known thing, even if you don't quite understand it, whether you're Jewish or not? Even if you're Jewish and don't quite understand what's all this Jewish humor nonsense?
Right.
Well, it's because we wouldn't have survived. I believe this strongly, if we couldn't laugh at ourselves throughout many points in history.
Right.
Many points of those are shortly after or even during attempts at mass extinction or race riots, anti-Semitism in general. Anti-Semitism has come to mean hating Jews. Right. Okay.
Even though being a Semite it entails like a huge swath of people, not just Jews.
I'm glad you said that. And that is always something that fascinated me. Semitic people basically means it relates to anyone in the Middle East.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
in these days, the Middle East is 90% Arab Muslim. Okay. Right. And those two things are actually mutually exclusive. You can be Arab without Muslim, and Muslim without being Arab. But in general, again, generalities, in the Middle East, 90% of the people in the Middle East are Arab and Muslim, okay? And yet, the word, from a literal standpoint, a Semite is anybody who is from the Middle East or whose family was originally from the Middle East. And so pretty much all Jews, unless they converted somewhere down the line to Judaism, we consider ourselves as being originally Middle Eastern people.
Right.
And maybe it goes back 2,000 or even more than 2,000 years. So we're talking about 100 generations roughly, but we still consider, genetically, and now with all these new age DNA testing and kits, we can actually test and confirm that, yes, we have DNA the same as the Arabs whose families have been in the Middle East for 5,000 plus years. We share that same DNA.
Right.
That's why we jokingly and only half jokingly say we're cousins to the Arabs, because not only do the different biblical works confirm that, but the DNA now.
The DNA backs up that what we're reading.
That.
Yeah. Something else. So you were saying like, you know, there wasn't like a one moment where it's like, oh, now I'm a Jew, and I'm and I may be wrong in saying this, but
Please.
You know, one thing that when it comes to when you're reading you know, the Bible, a lot of it is, you know, you're not your faith and, you know, is not separate from the rest of your life. Whereas in a lot of cases, you know, in at least in the United States or in cases of you know, that I read a lot for like testimonies and whatnot, is, you know, I was doing this one thing, and then you know, I heard the gospel message, and there is a, you know, a conversion moment, and, you know, where, you know, their faith and like what they were doing in their life was completely separate. And even in Christianity, which is also kind of a problem, is you have a lot of people that compartmentalize their life, where there's someone very different in their work, when they go to church, when they're at home, and they live a very different lifestyles in different places. But in the reality is, we're supposed to, our faith doesn't just leave us, you know, it has to be a part of our life. And in the case, what I see in the case of, you know, in the Old Testament and a lot of Jews that I know, it's like it's a very important part of who they are. And is that why you think that it's kind of there's not like a moment where like, oh, I'm a Jew now? Yeah.
Right. That's certainly part of it. I think that's a good description, in that faith is a tricky concept in Judaism. I'm sure it's a tricky concept in any religion, but in terms of, if I asked you guys as you know, Christians, as Protestants, what is faith, or what is faith to you, I would guess, and I could be wrong, that you'll have one or many different answers, you know, ready. What does that faith, what does the message of the gospel, as you say, mean to you? If you asked a Jew that, what does, you know, faith mean to you? What is your specific faith? That type of thing. Then even rabbis are going to have a tough time answering that question. You know, there's a famous line by a modern rabbi who was asked, you know, 10 or 20 years ago on a radio podcast, just like we're doing now. He was asked about faith in a combined summit of different different clergy members of different religions, and they were all asked about their relationship to God. And so they first asked this rabbi, what's your relationship to God? Do you have a close relationship? And he says, oh yes, the divine and I, you know, communicate in our own way all the time. There's many times I feel very close to God. In general, in my daily life, I like to feel close to God, and at certain times during religious services or otherwise, I especially have moments where I feel, you know, one with the divine. And then the way that that rabbi answered the question prompted the interviewer to say, well, Rabbi, how would you define your belief in God? And the rabbi says, that is a much harder question. And the interviewer is taken aback and says, well, Rabbi, I'll ask it in a simpler way. Do you believe in God? And the rabbi says, you know what? I'm going to have to get back to you on that. And it was a very honest answer, and very representative of how many Jews feel. You know, I could be wrong, and you can correct me, but I don't think you could call yourselves, you know, faithful or born-again Christians if you answered the question that way.
No.
In that,
no.
if you said, I'm a cultural Christian, but I'm kind of an agnostic when it comes to God.
No,
but
there are people that do that.
There are people that do that, but I'm guessing that's not the I'm guessing that's, you know, a smaller portion, or at least they're not those people, whoever they are not quite as accepted into the fold. In Judaism, not only are they accepted into the fold, but I would say that's the majority of Jews at any denomination.
Now, that's very interesting.
Okay, so that's what I mean when I say, as strongly as I did, that Judaism is a culture and a peoplehood first. That's what I mean. That's an example of how I feel on behalf of myself, but also how I feel on behalf of the hundreds and many thousands, as a matter of fact, tens of thousands of other Jews that I've met and thousands that I've taught, both youth and adults over the years.
That's very fascinating.
Okay.
Because I mean, we've had many discussions over the years, and this is actually like kind of the first time I've really kind of proposed that question to you, and very fascinating.
And I've never said that in so many words. And Robert and I, for all you guys out there, discuss this all the time. It's one of our favorite discussion topics, just to each other, and one of my favorite discussion topics and learning topics when I'm teaching youth groups at my synagogue or the various camps and Jewish organizations that I've worked at over the years. And it both makes people feel uncomfortable, but at the end, hopefully it gives them a sense of peace to tell them, as, at least my fellow Jews, whatever your personal faith is or isn't, that's okay, and it doesn't make you any less of a Jew. Okay? And the questioning, okay, it's the questioning of a Jewish person's faith from himself is not only normal, but I would say it's actually one of the essential parts of Judaism. In our later scriptures that we call the Talmud, after the Hebrew Bible, which is the Old Testament, was finished, there was no New Testament for us, okay? And we'll get into this and break it down specifically in a few minutes. But the Talmud, which the word literally means the learning, is a commentary for the most part and explanations on the Old Testament, okay? And a lot of it is devoted to questioning the precepts of the Old Testament, okay? Not just interpreting them, but actually questioning, the lines from the Bible. And so that, and the Talmud was written around and comprised around the same time as the New Testament, the first couple centuries AD. And one of the real bases of it is to learn, hence the name, but also to question yourself and question and obviously find answers, but some of it specific and or watered down answers to these big questions from the Bible.
So it's kind of like their way of being able to like wrestle with scripture, essentially.
Yes.
Okay.
That's what the Talmud is. It's a commentary first and foremost, but in that commentary, which was written and comprised by the rabbis and various scholars from the first couple centuries AD, there are also, there's a huge section called Midrash, which means myths or legends. Okay, and that whole multi-series book is a main part of the Talmud. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's myths and legends to explain some of the odd stories or cut-off stories from the Old Testament. Okay, and so that questioning has been part of Jewish history for almost 2,000 years. Not quite as old as the Old Testament, and not quite, I would say, as holy. If there's a contradiction, which there often is, then, the Torah, part of the Old Testament always ends up winning. Almost always ends up winning, okay? In the last 100 or 200 years, that's not necessarily the case anymore. Okay, there have been interpretations that actually do tend to go against some of the real, I would say, more difficult parts of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and the Old Testament as a whole. But in terms of the Talmud, which basically was the guide of how to live your daily life as a Jew for about 1,500 years, all through the Middle Ages and until the Industrial Revolution at least. it's really a book of interpretations, stories, and many more questions than they have answers. There are thousands of answers, but probably tens of thousands of questions, additional questions that the Talmud brings up about the Old Testament.
I see. Yeah, because in Christianity we have, something somewhat similar in the sense where, well, at least I know with Catholic faith, they do include some of what's known as the apocryphal literature, or there's several different types of literature, which, I don't include them as scripture, because a lot of them were historical narratives that were written at the time, or were kind of like the same thing. It was using stories to kind of wrestle with those different ideas that are presented in the Bible. And then there's just some outright it was false gospel narratives. Like the Gospel of Thomas is Gnostic literature, which was a huge heresy at the time.
One of the Gnostic Gospels.
And,
Right.
Yeah, and a lot of people turn to that and say, "Oh, what about the Gospel of Thomas?"
Right.
'Cause
Right.
supposedly
All the apocryphal. And fun fact, by the way, and this is, I'm going to split before we go into some talking about the actual denominations of Judaism. I'll have a comparison, which we'll go back to throughout this podcast, of comparing Judaism, and now I'll split it to Protestantism, to Catholicism. Okay,
Right.
Those three, fun fact, the books from the Bible, from the Old Testament, mind you, are the exact same for Jews and for Protestants, but, as Robert correctly said, different for Catholics. Catholics and the different groups of Catholics, if you want to get more specific, Roman Catholics versus Eastern Orthodox versus others, will add many of what both Jews and Protestants consider apocryphal books. Okay? The most common of these apocryphal books are probably Maccabees. Okay,
Right,
we
that's-
would have
that's-
heard of that. Okay,
right.
Most people have heard of the books of Maccabees, not part of the Bible. Okay,
Right.
not part of the Bible, and I'll complete that sentence for Jews or Protestants, but yes, part of the Bible, part of the actual liturgy for Catholics.
Right.
Okay.
But my point that I was trying to make is because the Talmud isn't necessarily seen as like they would always side more on the Torah than they would on the Talmud. I'm assuming that's what you were saying, right?
Yes.
And that's
right.
kind of similar in that case where it's not as necessarily as holy as like the
No.
rest of the Bible, but it is included in there as kind of secondary scripture, kind of.
Only for, and I think I would be wrong, although this may be more of a personal choice, whether you call the Talmud scripture. It's scripture of a certain nature, but to compare it to the New Testament is not correct in terms of how Jews look at the Talmud versus Christians look at the New Testament.
Right, that's not the point I was trying to make.
It is not holy scripture. I was only making that comparison for the time frame in history when it was written. We're talking about
But because a lot of those books that like the Maccabees and stuff, it was. Well, I mean, the Maccabees was kind of a historical book. It was talking about that time period of what was going on before we get to the New Testament.
Exactly, and before we get to the Talmud. So the Talmud mentions stuff about the Maccabees. Just, the quick history is for Jews, and I shouldn't say for Christians, but Jewish scholars have pretty much accepted, and everyone except for ultra-Orthodox Jews have accepted with them, that the Torah, at least, the 5 books of Moses, maybe not the entire Old Testament, but at least the Torah was finished and edited around the 5th century BC.
Right.
Okay, Maccabees, for example, was almost 300 to 400 years later. We know when it is. The War of the Maccabees, which are the Hasmoneans, in Israel was around 150. BC, 150 BC. And again, as we said, the Talmud was started to be composed probably around 100 AD and finished 300 years later.
Yeah, but because the other point I was also trying to make, because the Talmud is kind of you're wrestling with like trying to figure out what is being said in the Old Testament.
What's the meaning of the Old Testament?
Right.
Exactly.
And there's a lot of books that are kind of in that apocryphal, or there's another type of literature called the pseudepigrapha, which is people writing in other people's names. But it is kind of that idea. They're wrestling with what was being said in Scripture and how to deal with it, and that's kind of the comparison I was trying to make it.
Okay.
Make it with.
The Talmud not in short, but to try to give you a clear picture of what it is and how it's written, is actually, as somebody told me, and I said, you're absolutely right, it's written like a Reddit article. Okay? It's written from the inside out.
Okay.
Okay?
Mm-hmm.
And that inside, you think of a picture frame within a picture frame within a picture frame. One page of Talmud, okay, is written right in the middle of the page. You have a line from the Old Testament, most likely from Torah, okay, a verse. Okay, you have one sentence, one verse. Then you have the first level of commentary, which is from the rabbis of the Talmudic period, from the first couple centuries AD. Okay?
So you would categorize this as, I guess, like their commentary is just like, it's like threads, like it's just like thread on Reddit. Okay.
Exactly. And then there's the next level is the commentary on that commentary, and that was done by one person specifically. A few others at the same time. That was done by a rabbi that we call Rashi, okay, who lived in France in the 12th century, okay, AD, lived in the 1100s in France, and spent his entire life commentating on the original, the first level of Talmud from, 2 to 400 AD.
Wow.
Okay, which was then commentating on the Old Testament from, that had been around for 1,000 years already, at least.
Now, in those threads too, are they so like they'll have that couple first centuries of people commentating and questioning and stuff. Now, are there a lot as time had gone on where there are people that are like, wait, no, you're wrong, and they're putting in their own commentary that contradicts what maybe someone had said beforehand? So
the Talmud itself, when I said it was written, and I specifically, hopefully, didn't say it was finished because it wasn't. After, by 400 AD, it was edited. But then that second level, the full finished Talmud, was only finished after this Rabbi Rashi was done putting his commentary in there in around 1200 AD. And so the few old Talmuds we have are his writing. And by the way, there's the three main threads, the three main languages from those three periods. They're all in different languages. So studying this is actually much more complex in a way than studying just the Old Testament. Okay, you can learn biblical Hebrew, as I know a little bit of. I know enough to read. Translation comes
a little bit harder, yeah.
Same
for me.
But it's still one language. Okay, it's biblical Hebrew. When modern Hebrew was created, right around 1900, it's close enough to biblical Hebrew, at least for the nouns and the gist of the point of whatever you're reading, to understand a little bit of it. Okay. But the Talmud is taking, and I said it's taking a verse, right in the middle, that's the heart of what's being discussed, a verse from the Old Testament. That verse isn't even written in the ancient biblical Hebrew. It's actually written because they wrote that first level of Talmud in the first couple centuries AD, so it's written in Aramaic.
Oh, Lord.
Oh,
yeah.
So for those of you who aren't familiar,
and I'll say, because I've studied all those
and
languages. I took 2 years of Hebrew. I took 2 years of Greek. I took a year of Aramaic, and while similar to Hebrew, Aramaic is very different. The phrases are different. The only thing that's pretty much the same is the alphabet.
Yep.
That's it. Because even the vowels, the way that they show that up there is completely different. It's wild. And
Aramaic is written in the Hebrew alphabet, and you can take a guess, but it's no more than a guess if you know ancient or modern Hebrew, what a line of Aramaic is saying. Because again, the nouns in general are close, but it is a different language. It was the street language. Aramaic was the spoken language. Okay.
Right.
Similar to 1,500 years later, how Yiddish was the spoken language.
Whereas Hebrew is the written.
Hebrew is the written language.
Right.
Ancient Hebrew, for a long time, was considered too holy to be used as just the spoken conversational language. It was only read and studied and chanted, okay, when you were reading the Old Testament.
Okay.
Yeah.
It'd be kind of like, I guess, for English, like the old English and like modern English.
Mm-hmm.
Oh
As
yeah,
it were.
completely different languages.
Yeah, because because I remember
You
I
can't
saw
understand them. Yeah.
I clicked because everyone kind of like kind of haphazardly throws out the term like Old English,
Yeah.
whatever, thinking that it's like
It's
something,
Shakespeare.
like Shakespeare or
That's
like
not
from
true at all.
from the 1800s.
That's modern
Or,
English.
yeah, that's modern
Shakespeare
English.
wasn't even Middle English. Shakespeare was, as you
Yeah.
correctly said, was kind of the beginning of modern English in the
Mm-hmm.
16th century, and he was writing right around 1600. So as he was writing, modern English had basically been more or less completed and was being used at the time, and Shakespeare helped finish that use and created many words and many phrases, but this is all modern English.
Right.
Okay, thee, thou, though, ye, and yow.
That's not Old English.
That's not Old English. That's not Middle English either.
Right.
That's modern English.
Because both of those are unrecognizable. I mean,
Right,
we
it's
have a
like-
few phrases that we take from those, but they're
Old English, I have no idea. I only, as far as I know, there's only one manuscript that's been kept and reprinted, recopied in Old English that survived till today, and that's Beowulf.
Right.
Right,
Middle
right.
English, I'm sure there are a few. The only example, though, that I can think of is the Canterbury Tales by Chaucer. Okay, that was Middle English, so... and that kind of ended, went out of style, was transitioned into modern English by the mid-1500s. So it is similar that those were the spoken languages, like Yiddish was in the Jewish community, especially in the Eastern European Jewish community, for about 150 or 200 years, and Aramaic was the spoken and conversational language in the ancient Israel and the Middle East. In the few centuries at AD, first couple centuries AD, and maybe first century BC also.
yeah, because we have similar because we have a myriad of volumes upon volumes of theological works from a lot of the similar, like with the Talmud. We have a bunch of church fathers that have they wrote their ideas, their thoughts on what the Bible was saying, and it's in a myriad of different languages too. We have people that were at that time, a lot of people, like scholars, they knew Hebrew, they knew Greek. There's Latin that you had, and if you want to really study them, like you had to learn like Latin. There's French, there's German, there's it's all over the map, language-wise, of people that were dealing with this stuff, and it can get a little out of hand if
The scholarly works, even those that may
and
have been written-
and there's a lot of people that completely disagree with one another, and it's kind of you're reading these people questioning these ideas, and then you have another person from a few centuries later. It's like, no, that's complete. No, it's not that. It's this, and then you kind of you go in from another perspective, and you have to wrestle with all those ideas.
And by the way, folks, if you're still thinking, I'm pretty sure that Middle English was what Shakespeare wrote in was Shakespearean English, go look it up, Google Middle English, and you'll start to read, and you're like, oh, this is about a third French, a third German, and a third modern English. That's
Right.
more or less what
Well,
Middle
and
English
that's
was.
the other thing too when we're looking at kind of to digress a little bit, but the a lot of our terms and stuff, we have a lot of Latin, we have a lot of French, we have a lot of Greek influence, Italian influence in our language. Then that's why all of those.
All those early versions of English were...
it was like
yeah.
English was considered like the garbage language.
Yeah,
Yep,
it
absolutely.
really was.
Because it was like so many different influences. If it would, like they felt like it was too polluted, too like impure to be even considered a language.
And some of the peoples who started it were considered barbarians and got wiped out in the Middle Ages, like the Gaelic and the Germanic peoples,
Yeah.
in northern and Western Europe. Yeah.
Oh, and the people that tried to translate the Bible in English were burned to death for several
heresy?
centuries. Yeah.
Not surprised. Yeah. And so to bring it back, and one of the main topics to understand Judaism is that, like Christianity, like almost any religion, I'm assuming, although I can't say from a point of having done real research, but certainly Protestantism, Judaism is broken down into denominations. Okay?
Yeah, that was going to be kind of our next talking point is I think when a lot of people think of Judaism, they think people in funny hats and the curly Q sides.
Right.
Right.
What
I
we
think-
call the pay as the side curls.
Right. 'Cause
Right.
I don't think people are don't think of. I think they see Jewish as like a monolith. Where it's like, oh, you're a Jew, so you all believe the same thing. You all have the same
That's
customs
okay,
or
because
whatever.
growing up as a Jewish kid, I thought all Christianity was a monolith.
Uh,
Even in high school when I realized, or even before, probably junior high when I realized, Catholicism and Protestantism are very different. I
Right.
thought Protestantism was a monolith,
No.
and Catholicism
No, yeah,
was
yeah.
also a monolith. And now I've realized
It's very
that's not
complex.
true,
Right.
and they are both. To compare it to Judaism, you can argue all day whether it's comparable or not. What is similar are there are a lot of different factions and denominations among Protestants, as there are among Jews.
So can you break down a little bit for like what are some of the kind of like the mainline factions within
Right.
Judaism? Like because I know we've talked a little bit about this, that there are kind of like three kind of breaks within within Judaism, kind of similar with Christianity in a way.
And so you're right, although as is everything, it's much more complex than that.
Absolutely, same
But the
with
first
us.
thing you have to, even before breaking Judaism into, for us, we call them denominations. It's funny that the word factions sounds weird to my ears when we're talking about Judaism, only because the denominations of Judaism.
So you guys
almost
use
always-
denominations
we do.
too. Okay,
Because
well I wasn't sure if there was a different word
No.
that you guys use. I didn't want to just assume.
That's the no, that's okay. That's the perfect word. And mainly, I think of the word denomination meaning levels. And so it's levels of observance in Judaism much more than, I shouldn't say much more, but I think more than in Protestantism. You can have your Methodists, your Lutherans.
I would say that's pretty
your
apt.
Episcopalians talk about, I'm more religious, more observant than you. No, I'm more observant than you. In Judaism, the different levels are pretty much agreed upon on this observance scale.
I would say that's fairly apt because there are
Okay.
different levels of observance when it comes to certain denominations. There's some real loosey-goosey ones. There's some pretty heavy conservative, very, very observant.
And that's the other thing which is confusing when you're comparing Judaism to any religion. The conservative form of Judaism, which I consider myself in, is actually the direct middle of the road between secular and orthodox. Okay, so usually conservative means more observant, more along the lines of getting towards orthodoxy, and at least in English, and only in English because the Hebrew terms are actually clearer. Conservative means smack dab in the middle of the road. The Hebrew word translates as a much better description, I think. The Hebrew word for conservative Judaism means traditional Judaism.
Okay.
Okay, and we mean not traditional as in traditional practices of 2,000 years ago, but the traditions and the customs are the first and foremost most important thing before the religious and the faith connotations of it.
Okay.
So what would
Okay.
be those main breakdowns?
Main denominations.
Yeah.
So first, because I know I'm going to get yelled at, and rightly so, I'm basically going to be talking about 2/3 of world Judaism.
Okay.
Why am I leaving out the 1/3? I'll tell you right now. Before you even get to Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, secular, and everything in the middle, that's only talking about a little over half to maybe 2/3 of the world Jews, because you have to split it by nationality, by ethnic region. And what I mean by that is about 1,000 years ago, and probably more than that, but by a thousand years ago, there were two distinct ethnic groups of Jews, and within each ethnic group they had different levels of observance. Okay, the ethnic group I'm going to be focusing on are the Eastern European Jews, what we call Ashkenazi Jews. Okay, and the other group is the Sephardic Jews, which the word Sephardic means Spain, but it's both the Spanish Jews, the Mediterranean Jews, as well as Southern Europe, like Greek. Italian is about where you split it. There are Italian Jews who consider themselves Ashkenazi and those who consider themselves Sephardic. But the big break was solidified when, during the Inquisition, which for Jews was a terrible time,
Yep.
because all the Jews, all the Sephardic Spanish Jews,
Right.
were kicked out of Spain in and around 1492 and
Yeah.
went all over the world, but
Right.
primarily South America.
Yeah.
Okay. So,
Everyone that wasn't Catholic was kicked out of Spain at
and
that
that
time.
is still all those the descendants of those original Spanish and Mediterranean Jews make up about a third of the world Jews. So that's a huge, portion, okay? And yet they're very little talked about by those of us even sitting around this table who are just comparing Judaism. That comparison of just, smorgasbord of general Judaism
Right.
is usually meaning the Ashkenazi Eastern European Jews.
That,
Okay,
so that's usually,
Yeah,
so
I
when
think-
we're thinking
and that's
about
me.
Jews, that's usually who we're thinking about.
That is, even though
Okay.
you're missing, a third of the entire
Right.
world
I
Jews.
would have never
Right.
never thought of that.
There are other groups, mind you, basically the Yemenite Jews, and that doesn't mean the ones who are currently in Yemen, because there are very, very few currently in Yemen, but the
Right.
ones who came from Yemen 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, which was then known as the Kingdom of Sheba. Okay, there's that group. That's maybe 5%. There's a group called Mizrahi Jews, which is another 5%. But basically, world Jews today, my estimate, and I think I'm pretty close, is about 55 to 60% Ashkenazi, about 30 to 35% Sephardic, and 10% or less
everything
than 10%
else.
everything else combined. So that's why those are the two main groups. Now,
And why is there like well, you're saying that there is kind of is it like a schism between like all those groups,
Okay.
or is it like it just more of it just happenstance and circumstances kind of why there's more of you guys than
Right.
there are of them?
it was the latter, and there'd be a lot more percentage-wise of Ashkenazi Jews if not for the Holocaust, which wiped out, I think, two-thirds of the European Jews, about a third total of the world Jews.
Wow.
Okay? Believe it or not, you will hear that number all the time, that 6 million Jews were wiped out in the Holocaust. That 6 million were basically European Jews, and that was over 90% of the European Jewish
God
population.
damn.
Wow.
And at the time, there were only 18 million Jews in the world. And if we think we've recovered somewhat, but believe it or not, the current Jewish population, which are rough estimates, is around 15.5 million. So we have 2 million less than we did
Right.
in the 1930s
okay.
before the
So you-
Holocaust started.
Jesus
you barely
Christ.
Yep.
recruit half the number. Then.
Exactly. So exactly. That's a good comparison.
My goodness, that is
At the end of the Holocaust, obviously we started with 18. At the end, there were approximately 12 million world Jews. Those who had either come to America a few generations before, the very small percentage who got out, or the Sephardic Jews who had been kicked out of Europe for the most part 500 years before, 400 years before. And so then the numbers were probably pretty even between those Sephardic, as in Mediterranean and former Spanish Jews, and the Ashkenazi Eastern European Jews. And I mean Eastern European as of, you're genetically Eastern European from between 1 and 500 years ago. Such as myself. My family personally left Europe, specifically Poland and Romania and Western Russia area, around 1900, a little before World
Okay.
War One. So we came what we call fairly early, before the
Right.
big immigration waves. That's just my family. So my family's been in America for 4 to 5 generations, depending on the sides. But if your family got out as Jews, as Ashkenazi Jews from the Holocaust, then you've probably only been here for 2 to 3 generations. Okay? And hopefully they got out, because as we know, 6 million people didn't and were killed. And that's a whole nother story for a whole nother podcast.
Yeah, definitely.
But getting back on track.
So okay, so
describing
so
those Ashkenazi Jews.
what we're talking about as far as this a breakdown in denominations is mainly from this like Eastern
European,
Europe,
right.
Eastern European Jews.
And
Got
those
it. Okay.
are the more specific denominational breakdowns. So there was no schism between Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews, just to make it clear, like the 1 or 2, I think, great schisms.
We've
of
had
Catholics
at
and
least 2 huge ones. We
Right.
had the first one, which was the faction, the breakdown with the Catholic Church, which resulted in the Eastern Orthodox
Right.
and Roman Catholic, and then there was the really big one, which was the Protestant Reformation, yeah. And that's that was
So the one that they call the Great Schism is the first one, is
Right.
the Roman Catholic,
and that was
breaking out from
back
Eastern
in
Orthodox.
the
1200s? I'm guessing?
1200s.
Okay.
I'm probably getting that wrong. It's been a while since I've
I feel like it's
studied
around
that
the
topic.
Crusade times, and we both have a history teaching
Yes.
background, but these specific things are
Yeah,
not
it's
either of our
around
areas of expertise,
it's
so-
around that time, yes.
Okay. So, in terms of Ashkenazi and Sephardic, it was just the
Circumstances.
forced circumstances and or natural ethnic groups around the world, but around Europe specifically, in throughout the Middle Ages, and it just kind of formed a split, and et cetera, et cetera. So, getting back to the general,
Would that be considered like more like as a means of survival as opposed to like ideological
right?
ideological schism?
Because correct, it was a means of survival, not that we would have split off, but hey, there are different cultures, and this goes back to Judaism as a culture.
Right.
First and foremost, there are those two, and many more than two, but there are those two big, distinct culture groups of Judaism. The Sephardic Jews, whether they went to forcibly were kicked out and went to the Americas around 1500, or went to North Africa or back to the traditional Middle East and Israel, as some did, their culture of Judaism is very different looking than the Ashkenazi culture is.
Right.
Okay, what we share are the scriptures. Okay, both Torah, the Old Testament as well as Talmud. We share those. Even the interpretations are more or less the same, but the day-to-day culture
Very
of the
different.
Sephardic Jews often looks more similar to the Muslim Arabs than it
Oh, right.
does
Very
to
interesting.
us, what we call Western Jews. Okay, and yes,
Well,
Eastern
that- I
European,
mean-
but Western as in Western Hemisphere.
Well, I guess that does kind of make sense because of I guess like the more occupation of like Spain and Portugal and that area also. So
Yep, it forced them exactly. It was,
so again
yeah.
it was like one of those kind of like survival things where they kind of like kind of adapted
Yeah.
some of the customs or
And believe it or not, the Muslims who had taken over a lot of Western and Mediterranean Europe in the Middle Ages, some of those regimes actually treated the Jews fairly well. Often they treated them better than the Christians of the area, who were more persecuted. Okay, the Jews, as we might know, were the traditional, scholars, both doctors, lawyers, those what we think of as traditional Jewish jobs. Not only because they were, it's a stereotype, but it's a true stereotype for the most part, because Judaism is founded in an education, a real educational base, okay?
Right.
That whole line that I'll keep going back to, teach them to your children, that is a line, like I said, from Deuteronomy, that is specifically right after the 6-word verse. That is the affirmation of the Jewish faith, which that 6-word verse is basically translated as, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one." Okay? The basis of monotheism, and everything is kind of denoted in that line. The very next paragraph right after that line is, "You shall teach them to your children," and some other things. It actually commands you to love God, which is a whole nother very interesting and interpreted paragraph about commanding someone, the entire Jewish people basically, as well as Christians, because this is Deuteronomy, this is Old
Right.
Testament, commanding you to love, commanding love. But that's another thing. But within that paragraph, it says, very clearly, "You shall teach them," being the mitzvot, meaning the commandments of the Torah, but also the traditions and customs. "You shall teach them to your children for all generations." Okay. And that generation to generation phrase is said ad nauseum among Judaism, and rightly so, because it's probably the one thing among all others that has let us survive among every century, it seems, somebody wants to kill us.
Yeah.
As the Jews for a variety of reasons,
Right.
and we don't need to go into
And
that. But, yeah.
like I guess the dominance of like you know either like Jewish people or people of Jewish ancestry, like their dominance of like education or like the professional, like doctor, lawyer, or whatever, what have you. It could be also another like adaptation, because like they, Jews were
Always on the run.
always on the run.
Absolutely right.
So,
I'm
And
like,
glad
we've talked
you
about
said
that, yeah.
Because that is absolutely and simply the reason that
Right, yeah,
Jews.
because you can't,
Yep.
because you couldn't be like, you couldn't be a Jew and a farmer because you have to be in one place.
Yep.
But it made, but you could be a Jew and like
We had
a
to get
banker,
trades.
or
We
you
had
could
to
be-
create
yeah.
tradesmen. Yeah.
Like jewelers,
Jewelers.
like lawyers.
All these vocational things that you could take with you.
Yeah, and do
that
anywhere.
Your job, your occupation was based in knowledge for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, whether it was financial based, medical based, law based,
Mm-hmm.
as in lawyers, and the entire Torah, which again is synonymous, and we'll break it down in a little bit, with the 5 books of Moses, or often called the Pentateuch. This is all the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
That Torah, the word Torah, what does it mean? It means law. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
And so, yes, we joke and, in a good way, that what are rabbis, first of all, that they're not clergy members. They are that by association, obviously. But no, first and foremost, they're teachers, and then they're lawyers. They're biblical lawyers, okay?
Yeah.
It is their job to argue and interpret the law, the
Right.
Torah, the biblical law, for today's day of age, whatever that day is, whether it was 500 or 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago when the first, what we call modern rabbis, started to form.
Right.
So it's fun. Okay, then yeah, because that's pretty interesting because like in the Gospels, it always mentions that when Jesus was teaching and like the Pharisees or whatever would come, they'd always say like also lawyers were there,
Right.
and so that doesn't sound as strange because they were probably the whole like Pharisees
And what that means-
Sadducees, they were all like
Exactly.
rolling together and they were
Right.
like,
They were. And the Pharisees are the ones who survived. The Pharisees, to put it simply, and it's as usual, it's all more complex than this, but this is a good simplification. The Pharisees are those first generation of modern rabbis. that
Right,
I'm
because
talking
the
about.
Sadducees
They
were the
became-
nobility, and once the
Yes.
temple was gone, they were gone.
Yep, the Sadducees were among other things, those were the priests. Okay,
Right.
and Judaism, like Catholicism still does, had priests. Okay, until the Second Temple was destroyed in 70 A.D. And those priests, since they didn't, their first and main job was to take care of the temple. There was no temple.
no
Judaism
temple, no job.
became we call ourselves the people of the book because that's all we had. We took our books, we took our scrolls with us, but
And
we
got
were,
out of Dodge.
we got out of, we were kicked out of Dodge, and then we tried to come back 20 years later, and we're kicked out again, and then we tried to come back 50 years after that. Now we're into the middle 2nd century AD, and we're kicked out a third and a last time, and didn't come back until before modern Israel. We all think, we came back in 1948. No, we started immigrating back. When
about turn of the century, wasn't it?
When the Ottoman Empire
Fell.
exactly was starting to weaken.
Right.
Ottoman Empire fell at World War I, so this is 1918. The first big immigration wave of Jews started from Europe to Israel in the 1880s.
Yeah, that's right,
They're
yeah.
what we call the 4 aliyot. Aliyot meaning immigration waves specifically to Israel, not just general immigration or
Okay.
emigration. But that's what aliyah means. The word means going up. So wherever in the world the Jews were, north, south, east, or west, going up, metaphorically, meant immigrating to Israel. Okay? Okay? You're rising above your station by getting back however, whenever, wherever you could. And there were 4 big immigration waves. First one in the 1880s, then 1 more before World War I, and 2 after World War I.
Right.
Okay, between the 2 world wars. Those were how Israel got from a nation of mostly Arabs and Muslims, and there were, yes, a few thousand Jews at any one time. There were never 0 Jews in Israel, even when we were kicked out 3 times in a 100-year span.
Right. Heck, there wasn't even 0 Jews when the Babylonians took over because
Right.
there were a remnant
was a
that was left
remnant.
Most
behind.
of them were taken as slaves in whenever that was, 580s BC, but there were always a few thousand left behind. And the same thing through 2,000 years, there are always a few thousand, but only a few thousand at any time, until those few thousand became a few 100,000 between 1880 and the World War II, let's say. Okay, it was probably over 100,000, although I can't promise that. Already before World War I and after World War I, the two more immigration waves got it to about 500,000. So approaching World War II, there were, and this number is pretty well known, that there were approximately 500,000 Jews in Israel, what was still then Palestine, during World War II. Okay.
Okay, so we'll get back to our what we
Yes.
were initially talking about, that because that's all very fascinating
Yeah.
stuff. And there's a lot of, it's a lot more complicated than a lot of people realize.
It is.
So anyways, so go ahead.
Jews
and
are complicated people. That's why we have a Jewish joke, which many people, my friend Robert has heard many times. We say when you get two Jews together, you have three opinions. Okay. That's a well self-effacing joke that we love, and we say it all the time. And it goes back to that, Jewish scholars, rabbis specifically, but any Jewish scholar, and I like to consider myself one, because we like to be scholarly and teach our children the traditions as well as the faith. Those arguments, we call them debates, but they're real arguments, and there is a Hebrew word called, the word is machloket, and it means something to the effect of disagreement or debate. Okay, that word is like this holy word, in a joking sense, that this is what Judaism is all about. Okay, it doesn't matter, if one thing is completely agreed upon and has been for 2,000 years, it's still argued. Okay.
Yeah.
So, and it's argued especially, segueing back into the denominations, all those interpretations, the entire Hebrew Bible, which again is the Old Testament, is very hotly debated, the interpretations of said work, by the different denominations. So again, going back to just, what I'm familiar with, Ashkenazi Judaism, the Eastern European roots and descendants, you have, as Robert said, the three main groups. Orthodox, is the most religious, conservative is in the middle, and then Reform is the least religious of those three. Okay, and each of those has its, sub-varieties and subdivisions. Orthodoxy especially is a wide-ranging, is probably the widest range of observance levels just within, everything that kind of gets lumped into Orthodox Jews. Those are the ones who you see that they look, telltale Jewish. They often have what's called the payas, which means the side curls. And again, that's from a specific line in the Old Testament that says a man should not shave the four corners of his beard, is the specific line. Sorry, the four corners of his face. Okay, and where or what are the four corners of their face? It's been interpreted through the Talmud throughout the centuries and millennia as meaning your sideburns are two of the corners, and these two parts of kind of corners of your beard are the other two corners. Could it have been the corners of your mustache? Sure, but that's not how it was interpreted.
Right.
So even though more Orthodox religious Jews will, they'll shave, but they'll shave their mustache, they often will not trim their beard either ever, or at least parts of their beard they won't trim ever, as well as they won't ever cut their sideburns from, their entire life.
So it's kind of like the Amish and their observance of growing beards, but you don't
because that's a sign of marriage. I think it's
right.
like that.
Also,
Yeah,
but then
I'm not as
but then
familiar
they
with
also,
it's very different.
And they
from
obviously do
this
trim
case.
their beards because they have those kind of telltale signature beards, but they're not the same as the Jewish beards that
right.
can get to your
but then
belt by
but
the
then
time
like
you're
when
old.
you
Yeah.
but then you also don't think of them as having mustaches either. So
That's
Right.
right. They clearly shave their mustaches. So if that is from that interpretation, or I should say that same line of the Old Testament, which it might be, that'd be something that'd be worth looking up. They obviously interpret it in a similar, although not the same way,
Yeah,
but
exactly.
clearly those four corners are not including your mustache.
Yeah.
Now,
And for them, they're not including their sideburns either, though, because they don't
Yeah.
keep their sideburns.
Now, and I may be wrong, like with the Orthodox denomination, don't they also like tie like scripture onto their like body as well?
Believe it or not, so do we. So,
Oh,
and
okay.
you've never seen me do this, and I wish I had brought in a set, and my set of what we call tefillin, and I dislike the English word of that. I'm just going to call it tefillin. The English word is from Greek. They call it phylacteries. Okay.
Yeah.
And whenever I see that, and I only heard that word for the first time in high school.
It does
okay?
sound rather suggestive.
Yeah.
It sounds suggestive, and it also sounds completely confusing. What the hell is a phylactery?
Right.
Okay. And
Sounds like they misspelled factory.
it does, right?
Or
and,
it's-
Or something else.
Yeah.
and I guess it exactly. And I guess it refers to a leather band or a leather something because it is traditionally leather.
Right.
It has to be if you're being going by the law of, again, the Old Testament and the Talmud. The Talmud is the interpretation of, again, a line in the Old Testament that says, you shall bind them, and the them, again, as I said, is referring to the commandments. Yep, so Scripture itself. Okay, the actual words is what is interpreted as. You shall bind them around your arm and between your eyes. Okay, around your forehead, meaning
Okay.
between
okay.
your
Yeah.
eyes.
Oh, so like headband.
It's
It's,
exactly a
it's
headband.
like kind of like it looks somewhat like a
Yep.
headband with like a little box.
The between your. That's exactly what it is.
Right.
Okay. It's there's two parts of a set, and the one is a long piece. That's just one long piece of leather with the box, and that little box has similar inside. It's just a little scroll, little mini scroll of scripture. Okay. It can be specific things, but it doesn't have to be a specific thing. It's similar to, for those of you who've seen a mezuzah, which is that little approximately 4 or 6 inch long piece of metal or wood that Jews will nail to their doorpost.
Oh yeah.
Believe it or not, the mezuzah,
my,
the tefillin, okay, the leather straps, and what I mentioned before, the line of teach them to your children, that's all the same paragraph. That's why it's considered such a holy paragraph, and because it's after the 6-word verse of the affirmation of the Jewish faith. This is all this one paragraph in Deuteronomy, and why I haven't specifically told you the verses of Deuteronomy where it's from is another thing I want to get into in a few
Okay,
minutes.
yeah.
Is that unlike, I would say, religious Christians and even some non-religious Christians, some scholarly Christians, they have memorized parts of their Bible and memorized the actual chapter and the verse of the book where it comes from.
You guys don't have that.
Jews, not that we don't have that, but we don't do that in general. Even rabbis usually don't memorize the actual verse, chapter and verse of a specific line. We memorize it in a different way, the portion, and again, this is just Torah for now, just the 5 books of Moses, in other words, the Pentateuch. Okay, so for the Torah, we actually, about 1,000 years ago, split it, and I'll get back into this because this is fascinating, into 54 portions. Okay, so
54.
those are 5 books, so each of those 5 books has approximately 11 portions. Okay, either 10, 11, or 12 to get to 54. Okay, some of those splits are natural splits, as in the end of one story and the beginning of another, and I bet you if I laid down a copy of the Torah or the Pentateuch for you guys, you would be able to guess on at least half of those splits correctly. And again, these splits were made, give or take, around 1,000 years ago. Okay, at the same time that the, what we call trope, the musical notation for chanting the Torah was created, as
Yeah.
well as Hebrew vowels.
It's very
were
musical.
created. Yeah, it
Yeah.
is. And it's a set of music. Because when you read the Torah, which we do every Sabbath, as well as if you're religious, two other times a week on Mondays and Thursdays, but for almost all Jews, every Sabbath, so at least once a week. We don't actually read it, not traditionally. We traditionally chant it. Then we study it too. We study
Right.
what we're chanting.
It's because I went
Yep.
and observed that it's actually very beautiful.
It is. It is, and it comes from the tradition in the Middle Ages of chanting it for those who could not read biblically Hebrew in the marketplace in the bazaars of the Middle Ages in the Middle East. Okay. And so, but again, getting back quickly to the denominations
Right.
before
So we were
talking
talking
into the comparisons of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible versus, which is the Old Testament, versus the Christian and Protestant versions of it. Those denominations also do see and read their Bible differently. Okay? The more Orthodox, as you can imagine, and some believe it strongly, that the Bible is both the Word of God, but also, or because of that, I should say, is divine, not just divinely inspired, but divinely written. Okay?
Divine itself.
Divine itself.
So it's almost, in a sense, it's kind of worshipped.
Exactly.
Okay.
And yes, and Jews have a very complex relationship with what we call idol worship, which is just the general, totems and objects. And Catholics understand exactly what I'm saying because there's often parts, and you can describe it more specifically, I'm sure, just having studied Catholicism, not actually being Catholics, that at Catholic churches, most Catholic churches, if not all, there's a piece of something that they keep on the altars, and there's a word for it, which I can't think of, a
relic.
That is, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. They have relics.
Yeah.
Okay. They have relics that they keep on their pulpits or on their altars.
Yeah.
Okay. That's supposedly a historical relic. Okay. That's of religious significance. Okay. Jews.
And so the Orthodox Jews have this too?
They don't, because it goes against one of the main premises, one of the first commandments.
Right.
I believe it's the second or third of the 10 commandments, is do not worship idols.
Right.
Okay, it's the second commandment. Yeah, it's number 2. Number 1 is that there's one God. Okay, is kind of the monotheism base. Okay, of all Judeo-Christian as well as Muslim faith.
Right.
And so it's pretty high up there. It's pretty early on. And the 10 Commandments, by the way, are not the first 10 Commandments in the Bible.
Nope.
But they're considered not at all. If you're a Jew, you either believe or you've studied that, according to tradition, again, traditionally, there are 613 commandments in the Torah. What does that mean? That, among other things, there are 613 times where you read the line in the Torah, in the Pentateuch, that God said to Moses saying, and whatever that next verse is, if applicable, is a commandment. Is
right.
One of the 613. Yep. Now, I can pretty much promise you there are not 613 times that line comes up, but they're close to that. Okay? It's around 500.
Because I know that there's big swaths of sections of, like, they're writing down what Moses was reciting, what God told him.
Exactly.
What were the laws.
And it says the Hebrew translation is either God said to Moses saying, or God said to Moses, tell the Israelite people, the ancient Jews, in other words, this. And if it's a thou shalt do this or thou shalt not do this, it's clearly a commandment, and it's considered one of those 613 commandments, of which the 10 commandments are just 10. Okay. So, going back to that idol worship, to put it mildly, but also plainly, Jews have a very complex relationship with that, because we do have the Torah, and in this case, I'm not just referring to it as the general Pentateuch, but the actual Torah scrolls, which traditionally you have at least one of in every synagogue. Okay, that's what you read out of. Yes, we have printed versions just in normal books of the entire Old Testament, including, specifically the Torah. But when you read it, when you chant it, I should say, okay, on Sabbath, every Sabbath, you chant it out of one of those scrolls.
Right.
And to make and produce one of those scrolls, it costs about as much as a new car. It costs about $20,000.
Holy shit.
So these are our, for lack of a better word, relics.
And they're giant. They are huge.
Yes, this is something that is about 2.5 to 3 feet tall, and it weighs, depending on the type of wood, which is more important because the scroll is long, and I'll estimate how long in my head and give you a good estimate in a second. depending on the type of wood, the thing can weigh, a whole Torah scroll can weigh at least 10 pounds. That's probably the lightest, and can go up to about 30 or 35 pounds.
What?
Yeah, I mean,
Well, it
it's
depends
they're
on also the
gigantic.
material, like
The
you-
type of
Yeah.
wood. You can make it out of, and don't quote me on this, but you can make it out of almost any type of wood. The scroll itself has to be parchment, meaning animal skin.
Right.
Okay. From certain types of animals. Usually it's cowhide, it's leather.
Yeah,
In
though-
other words,
and
the
though
very
that's,
thin line is parchment.
How that's made, that no wonder it's so
Yeah,
so
because
expensive.
it takes a scribe, and this is a specialized, thing that and they are scribes, they're Torah scribes. Takes them, I think I hear, about 9 or 10 months to write the entire thing,
Jesus.
and I assume that's working 8 hours a day, although I'm not positive of that. Okay, but
Assuming that they don't take any sick days.
assuming they don't take any sick days, it takes a long time to write a Torah scroll, because when you unroll it, which we do, you can anytime, it's not considered profane or blasphemy to unroll it, as long as you're careful. It is, interestingly enough, considered slight blasphemy to have it touch the ground. So there's different things when we carry it around, and we do carry the Torah scrolls before we open it up to a section, and a specific section every Sabbath. That's pre-noted 1,000 years ago, actually. We carry it around the synagogue so that everyone can see and touch, and it's considered holy, so to speak, to touch the Torah, or kiss a prayer book and touch the Torah with it. Okay, right. And that's all the outer part. You don't actually want to touch the ink, because it'll smear, and then everyone will be very angry at you.
yeah, absolutely.
Because it'll cost you don't have to replace the entire thing for $20,000, but it'll cost a few $100s to
To
replace
repair.
just that section.
Now, in the case of when they're writing, those scribes are working on those, what? Because they're obviously they're handwriting it. It's not some computer
can't
printer
print it.
that if they make a mistake, they have to pretty much start over again, don't they?
So yes and no. In cases of hundreds of years ago, that may have been the case. Now the way they do it, there are a lot of modern interpretations of every single aspect of life, including writing the Torah itself.
Right.
And so you'll see different portions. It's written in columns, and you can look it up online, and you'll see exactly what I mean. And it is also stitched together, I want to say, every 3 to 4 columns. So if you make a mistake,
Oh, so you're not starting over from
you're not
scratch,
starting over
but
from Genesis. No. you
so
are
it's kind
not.
of like it's kind of like the Stanley Cup, where you can kind of take out the
Yes.
sections of it. Okay.
That is a great comparison. Yes, you
Comparing the Torah
Torah
to
to
the Stanley Cup.
I love it. And it's carried around once or twice a year. It's danced around with, like the Stanley Cup is every year after
Right.
it's
Oh,
won.
yeah,
And often you get into iffy territory of it's being danced around with and worshipped to a degree. Okay, and that's why the line is definitely vague and blurred. And at the same time, it's danced around with in a party-type atmosphere where a lot of people are drinking, including the ones who are holding it and dancing around with it. So often you have one person holding it, and you pass it off whenever you feel like, every few minutes or whatever. And besides that one person, there's a group of 2 or 3 people who are standing very close to that person watching how he or she is dancing around with it to make sure they don't slip or trip themselves.
Right.
And
So they have spotters.
They have spotters, exactly. So you have spotters, yes.
It's like the guy with the gloves
Yeah.
with the Stanley Cup.
Exactly, exactly. And I just heard actually the other week that they're trying to disallow people from drinking out of it now, the Stanley Cup.
What?
Which used to be a huge tradition.
Yeah,
of it.
that's a huge.
So
thing.
the Torah, the same thing, is you actually dress it up. You literally, there's the scroll, which is held together by 2 wooden posts. But what you do is you tie what we call a belt around it. It's just a sash to keep it closed, okay, when you're carrying it. So you carry it by the 2 bottom parts of the post, usually like this, and kind of around your chest so it's secure. But on top of the belt, you put a mantle, looks like a pillowcase, okay, usually fancier and thicker. And then very often, you put mantle pieces around it. You put a breastplate, which is almost always metal. Okay, you just hang it around kind of the 2 top posts, and you'll put what we call crowns, which are just these kind of top mantle pieces, also out of metal. They look like a Japanese pagoda. Okay, multi-layered, crown is what we call it. It can look like one huge crown that could fit your head that you place over both posts. That's common too, but usually it's 2 individual small ones. So the post is, whatever, yay thick, and you put the crown on top of each post with bells so that you can hear. That's the main point of the dressing of the Torah. One of the big traditions, however you dress it, whether it's metal or just wood or anything else, you, I believe, have to have bells so that you can hear it coming around, because it's considered holy enough. Whenever somebody is carrying it around, they're obviously walking around. Everyone in attendance, even if you don't see it, have eyes on it at the time, you should stand up. And so those bells tell you to stand up, and that's, again, an old tradition from the marketplace days of the Middle Ages.
Very interesting.
So getting back to the different denominations. So the Orthodox, you can visually you can tell someone who's Orthodox, yeah.
Almost always, although, again, there are different sub-levels within Orthodoxy, and the ones who are still consider themselves and are considered Orthodox, but what we say modern Orthodox, which is the less observant of the whole Orthodox spectrum, you might not be able to tell them apart if you pass them on the street.
Right.
Okay, they are probably wearing a head covering, but that head covering, as you often see in a synagogue or even out on the street for more religious Jews, it's called a kippah or a yarmulke, which means the same thing. It's this little skull cap, but it doesn't have to be that. It can be any head covering, including a baseball cap, any hat. And so that's why I'm saying you could pass a modern Orthodox person. More, getting into ultra-Orthodox are not going to wear baseball caps as their head covering.
Right.
They'll wear either a traditional hat or one of these skull caps, or both. But a modern Orthodox person, certainly more religious than me. I'm not going around in a kippah, skull cap, or hat all the time.
You're not?
I'm not. Oh my God, I'm bald. I just
it just
realized
looks
it for
like
the first
you.
time. I'm sorry. I need a few minutes, jerk faces. I need to settle this. I need to thanks a lot.
Yeah.
All right.
We just shattered his reality.
Right.
Yeah.
So right now, between the three of us around this table, who's the most Jewish looking? Bam. Because he's the one,
Yeah, 'cause
we only
he's the
one with the
one
head
who
covering,
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
And
right.
on top of that, I'm like, I got my Team
Team
Israel hat.
repping Team Israel. We haven't pointed this out yet, but we should. Repping Team Israel, the Jewish star. Okay, thank you. So that's okay. So that's Orthodoxy.
Okay, so explain. So you're kind of
I'm
another
conservative,
denomination down from that, and
exactly.
you would be called conservative Jew.
Jews, exactly. In Hebrew, it translates to traditional Jews, but it's more one who is apprised of the tradition and the culture part of the tradition, not the traditional animal sacrifices of Old Testament days.
Well, none of that's happening
None of the
today.
Jews do that, right. Even the super ultra-Orthodox are not sacrificing animals.
Because there's no temple, right?
Why? Because there's no temple. There's no physical temple. And I and all Jews of all denominations will often use the word temple to represent our shul or our synagogue, but synagogue is the correct term. Temple is not. Why? Because there was only ever one temple in Israel at a time.
So they kind of...
Yep. And that's what was destroyed twice in 586 BC and again in 70 AD.
Right. So,
After it was rebuilt,
okay,
obviously.
so temple is really only reserved for the actual temple within Israel.
If you're being technical,
Technical.
and no one does these days, my synagogue is called Temple B'nai Chaim, okay, which translates to, okay, and there are a lot of different, temples in the U.S. and Israel that call themselves temple, this, temple, that, instead of just this synagogue or that synagogue.
Right. So it's just
just a
become kind of part of the
Nomenclature.
yeah, exactly.
It has. But when you put the in front of the word temple, okay, the temple, you're probably referring to...
so that's why it's I'm going to temple. I'm not going to
the
the
temple. Exactly.
Because no one's going to
To
the
the
temple
temple.
anymore.
Right.
Yeah.
And, that's what's in Israel, in Jerusalem, in the Old City.
This is the Western Wall.
Is the remains. And fun fact, that Western Wall, which is the only wall standing of the temple, was not actually the Western Wall of the temple. It was the outer retaining wall of the entire
Thing.
what they call Temple Mount complex, because it
see.
was built on an already existing hill,
Right.
which traditionally is the hill that Abraham went up to sacrifice Isaac in the Akedah story.
Yep.
Okay, that's that Temple Mount. It's called Mount Moriah. Okay, that's where traditionally Solomon, right around King Solomon, around the year 1000 BC, when Israel was still a Jewish kingdom, built that first, what they call the first temple. It was destroyed 400 and change years later, rebuilt in the couple centuries after that, and predominantly finished being rebuilt by King Herod, known as Herod the Great, right around the year 0. And that time, the second temple, the second version of this temple, only lasted 70 or so years and was destroyed by the Romans the second time
Right.
in 70
Right.
AD.
So okay, so you're so you'd be a conservative Jew,
Right.
and a lot now. I wonder is as far as like observance of scripture, obviously, like obviously in a sense of your attire, I wouldn't know that
You
like
wouldn't know
you're
me
a
if you
Jew.
passed me on the street,
Exactly.
right. If my nose doesn't give me away, sorry folks, but I couldn't resist. Then no, I'm just your average person.
Because I know with the Orthodox there is a lot of the visual component too,
Yeah.
where it's like it's kind of they're a Jew.
Right.
It's kind of hard to.
Right, how hard to miss that. So, and often the things you see them wearing are, we already talked, actually, we jumped from some of the most basic clothing items.
I know they have like the tassels.
Right. And good, that's actually probably a better word. I just call it fringes.
The fringes, yeah.
Yeah, the word, that's good, actually calling it a tassel. I think people know what that means more.
The things that your cat bat around.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Hebrew word is
Sorry, with the fringe
tzitzit,
on
and
top?
we usually translate it as fringes that are coming out of, it looks like they're coming out of their belt or pants. No, it's actually you're wearing an undershirt, which, just a t-shirt, okay? The shirt doesn't matter. It can be a pillowcase, as often people do make it out of pillowcases. These, again, are for Orthodox Jews, okay? You're wearing it, and those tassels or fringes represent those 613 commandments. The way they're knotted and tied, they're not knotted and tied and wrapped 613 times, but they are in a specific way knotted and wrapped a certain amount of times, and the Hebrew word, funny kind of word, tzitzit, sounds like a tsetse fly, but okay, represents the number just the number 613. Okay, and yeah, we jumped to the leather, what's called tefillin. Okay, those leather wrappings that you wear when you're praying. Not even 2,000, but let's call it 1,000 years ago, and maybe even several hundred years ago. Orthodox Jews did wear the tefillin all day. It's a certain tradition to do so. I don't think in any Jewish community now, but you can do it. It's not bad. It's just you traditionally wear it when you're praying on all days, except for the Sabbath, interestingly enough. Okay. And that's for another podcast, why you do certain things and don't do certain things on the Sabbath as a Jew, besides praying and going to shul, going to synagogue. But that tefillin is, again, from that one line in Deuteronomy about wrapping the commandments, physically. It's thought to be around your arm and between your eyes in that headband. Okay, it's those boxes. And it's been interpreted you do that when you're praying. The tzitzit, the fringes, okay, it's part of the way I wear mine when I do, which first of all is only on Sabbath and the holidays. I don't wear it every
Throughout the
day
week, yeah.
because I'm not Orthodox.
Yeah.
Okay. But I could. It wouldn't be bad. It also wouldn't make me Orthodox just by doing that one Orthodox
Right.
type custom.
Yeah, right.
I'd have to do a lot more than that, but that's an interesting and I would say a decent start. I will wear mine as part of the prayer shawl, okay? What they call the tallest. The prayer shawl, which all Jews, even Reformed Jews, less religious than me, will traditionally wear at synagogue, has those 4 fringes.
Right.
Okay, and so yes, you can wear a shawl all day round. The shawl itself kind of looks like a scarf, is nothing special in and of itself, just like the kippah as a head covering is nothing
so it
special.
could be a tablecloth for all
It
the
can be a
matters.
tablecloth, and I'm glad you said that. That's only because the one I have looks like a cape, and it's basically the size of a tablecloth. So it can be a scarf, but it can also be one huge square of fabric. Okay?
So it
can
doesn't
also
really-
be a T-shirt. That's
Right.
my point.
So it doesn't really
fringes-
matter
no.
what it is, as long as the
fringes
fringes
are
are
what
there.
matters.
That's
Yep.
what the
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 important
fringes
part.
are tied
Okay,
on
so
in a
the
certain
fringes
way.
are what distinguish it.
Distinguish that prayer shawl or tallis, and you call it a the Hebrew word translates to mini tallis when you're wearing the T-shirt that just has the fringes
I see.
kind of tied to the holes in the bottom of the T-shirt. Yeah.
So in a lot of ways, everyone kind of does
own
those
thing.
things, but it's as far as like the amount of observance of those things.
Just like the Torah, the Bible is interpreted in different ways and to different levels of interpretation. Okay, in terms of observance levels, we observe things, customs, traditions, laws, even what we might call laws, at different levels.
Okay.
Okay, and so that's why when you get into what I am as a conservative Jew, I tend to honor and celebrate Sabbath. We call Shabbat. It's the same word.
Don't
As
roll
well-
on it.
Don't roll in it. Exactly. As well as the holidays. And the main thing we don't do on Shabbat is work. Now, what does work mean? Well, it's been that whole word work
Right.
as relating to Shabbat, the Sabbath, has
There's
been
some people that won't
interpreted
even
through-
like turn on light switches.
Exactly.
Or,
Throughout the
or-
centuries
or
in many
start
different
fires.
ways.
Yeah.
Because you're creating fire and creating or destroying
Right, that was-
anything. And again, what does that mean? Oh, now you're getting into this is why Talmud is what it is. It's like a Reddit thread.
It's funny 'cause
okay?
now, like, that
it's
joke-
interpretation of interpretation of interpretation of the Bible.
Right.
It's funny because all of the kind of like ceremony and ritual things
Yep.
like it. That now that joke kind of like makes sense. Like when
Yep.
when you tell a Jew that I'm thinking about converting to Judaism, like, it's not that great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And believe it or
not to knock
only
anyone.
is it not that great, but no, you're not knocking at all. We actually make sure our proposed converts, those interested in converting, are serious. And this is something that I've always felt strangely about is, man, if you forget forced conversion, which of course was, often a Christian and Catholic, belief for a long time. Jews, the word proselytizing, as in converting, usually it means forced conversion, but any type of converting, that's a dirty word. Proselytization is a dirty word in Judaism.
You're not gonna find some Jew at your door on Sunday morning and like
Yeah.
they're like
No, us Jews are not riding our bicycles
can I
and
tell you-
knocking door
what is
to
it,
door saying, hey, don't I have a
Have you-
religion for you? Nope, that doesn't happen.
So yeah, can I tell you about my yarmulke?
Would you like to know about my nice fringes here
Yeah.
and leather straps that make it impossible to move my arm? Also, fun fact about that tefillin, which many people haven't even seen, but for maybe another installment of this podcast, I'll bring my set and put it on. You always wear it on your off arm. Why do you wear it on your off arm? Okay, you wear a headband between your heads, which doesn't make you blind. You wear the box like here, so it's
Right.
not actually blocking your vision.
that'd be.
But you
really-
it's wrapped several times in a certain traditional way, like everything else in Judaism, around your arm and around your hand and fingers. So it actually makes it impossible to fully close your hand as well as to grab onto something.
So you
Okay.
lose dexterity.
You lose dexterity. Yeah, you lose the ability to bend your arm fully. So you wear it on your off arm for the simple reason that during the Middle Ages, Jews often had to fight for their lives at a moment's notice, sometimes while they were praying in synagogue. And so they wanted to make sure they could hold a sword or a weapon with their good arm. And so it became tradition, not originally, but during the Middle Ages, to wear that tefillin, those prayer wrappings on your off arm.
less dominant arm.
On your less dominant arm. Yep, so that you could hold
So
the
again,
sword.
but then it goes back again to that thing where like a lot. It seems like a lot of like traditions or customs were purely for survival purposes.
Absolutely. And many of the customs that we do, I would even say the vast majority of them have been changed over the centuries, especially during the Middle Ages, out of necessity. Because we couldn't do certain things in our homes or even in the village synagogue without fear of some group of non-Jews who were anti-Semitic, who were hateful of us for any number of reasons, either jealousy or just, that they thought we were doing evil things because somebody convinced them of it.
Right.
Sometimes their own priests, sometimes the Catholic Church, which, let's face it, and without getting into it, has not been the most honest and good institution throughout history.
I'll agree with that. Yeah.
Oh, okay, right.
I'm no fan of the Catholics.
Right. And the church
Yeah.
today,
What is it? It's the only religion with the king.
Right.
Yeah.
In a way, it is. And often, throughout times in history, the king and the pope are one and the same, and that's never good to have too much consolidated power in one or even a few
Without-
people.
Oh, yeah, I have a whole.
King Henry.
That's another whole nother.
On the next
King-
episode of the Circle of Jerks,
Yeah, that's
we
a whole
attack
nother
the Catholic
episode.
Church. Oh, sorry, I didn't say
King
that.
Hen- the Church of England, King Henry VIII. It's
Right.
like, I'm the Pope now.
Exactly.
Yeah. Oh,
exactly.
Lord.
So that's that. And so to make kind of segueing into comparison into what do Jews think of their clergy, our rabbis, compared to, say, the Protestant pastor or reverend, which I'll have to ask what the distinction is. There might not be one. As well as comparing those two to the Catholic priest is, I think, kind of the next natural discussion.
Well, I guess because I'm still like a little bit curious as far as it's like what would
how we define the Bible and how
no
we
no
read
no
the
how
Bible?
how are you different than like the Orthodox other than like the visual components, because you do a lot of the same things, I would
we
assume,
do.
right?
And as a matter, we do. And okay, if I can answer this simply, if there is such a thing as a simple answer, I would be and have been fairly comfortable in Orthodox Sabbath services. Okay, I've gone to them and go to them all the time. And I mean all the time, several times a year. Okay, not every week, but several times a year just to visit Orthodox friends at their respective synagogues. The synagogue looks the same. It's treated the same. The worship service is the same. The Torah and biblical readings are not just similar, but are identical for
'Cause
every Jew of every denomination around
have-
the world in any given
You
week.
have like a
That's what's
worldly,
interesting.
you kind of like a schedule that you guys follow,
Yes.
that like on this day, this is where we're going to be
Okay.
reading at.
Why, and I brought it up before but didn't go into detail, and this is a good answer to your question of how do I differ as a conservative middle-of-the-road Jew to the more religious and Orthodox Jews. It's not what we read, because when I say we read the identical thing, I mean it. We have the schedule that was created around 1,000 years ago and goes back to the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, being subdivided into 54 portions, and we just call them the Torah portions. Why 54? So that we can read about one a week. There are 52 weeks in the year. Okay, occasionally we double up. Occasionally we skip a week if a major holiday like Passover falls over Shabbat, which it always does. Why? Because Passover is an 8-day holiday. So, okay, one of those 8 days, if not 2 of them, are going to fall on the Sabbath. And we'll skip a week and read a special designed portion, again, of the Torah, but not from the weekly reading. So, during roughly the Jewish New Year, the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur times of the year, which usually falls in September and October, or October, we end and start the cycle of the Torah reading again. Okay, from Genesis through Deuteronomy. And like I said, we read the number of chapters, I couldn't even tell you, but I'm going to estimate, and you probably know better than I do, that there are an average of 30 or so chapters per book of the Bible. Genesis has around 30, as does Exodus, etc.
Genesis is a little bit longer. Genesis is about 50.
Okay.
I think Exodus is,
Something in the 40s.
it's closer to 40 on that one.
I
But yeah, but
know
but
the
an
longest
average
book of the entire Bible, of the entire Old Testament, I should say, is Isaiah with 66 chapters.
Right.
Yeah,
that
yeah.
number I know off the top of my head because we
if you
often
discount
read chapter.
Psalms.
Correct, as good point, 150 Psalms.
But yeah, but like on
point.
average, I would say 30 chapters is pretty.
Yeah.
That's a good
Okay,
average.
good
yeah.
average. Okay, we'll call it 30 to 40.
Yeah.
So-
As far as the Old Testament goes, I would say that's a
Right.
good average.
Okay, so my point of, and this is just the Torah, by the way. We don't subdivide the other the other 2/3 basically of the Old Testament, and the Hebrew word for it I haven't said yet. We call it the Tanakh. Okay, and Tanakh is just an anagram, not an anagram, but it's an acrostic in a way. Okay, it's an abbreviation for the three parts, the three parts that we divide our Old Testament into. Okay, Torah, the T is for Torah, is the first part. The N is for the Hebrew word for prophets, and the that CH letter, which is kind of a K, is for the Hebrew word for writings. Okay, and as I understand it, and we might get into this today, we might run out of time and get into it on another day, the divisions, even though the books are the same of the Jewish Old Testament versus the Protestant Old Testament, the books are exactly the same, but I know they're in a different order.
Yep, that is true.
And as a matter of fact, where we have our three sections, okay, Torah, Pentateuch is the same. That I
Absolutely
understand.
the
Five
same.
books of Moses are the 5 books of Moses, the world around, as far as I know. Okay, any Judeo-Christian religion or denomination. But I believe the Protestants have a fourth section which takes away, called histories, right?
So, well, I mean,
there's prophets, there's writings, but there's also histories section.
Well, there's the historical
exactly.
narrative, which is kind of like what we would say, like Genesis is a lot of the like the Kings or
Chronicles.
yeah. Well,
okay.
Well, yeah. Chronicles would be considered There's a couple different things that
I know
Chronicles
that
fall
even
under.
the writings and history sections for Protestants
Right,
are
because
different
we have
than our writing section. We have no histories. I also know that our prophet section includes a different number and selection of actual prophets than the Protestant Old Testament does. Okay, we have Jews have some of the writings of the prophets, especially the latter prophets, in our writing section, not in the prophet section.
Right.
And I know that's the case too, but for example, Ruth is the example I always give. Ruth, the book of Ruth, is much earlier in the Protestant Bible. It's actually
It's
the
right
middle
after
of-
Judges.
It's right after Judges. Okay, so through Judges, it's the same. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, and that's the same. Those 7 are the same for Jews and Protestants. Then you put Ruth in there. We don't have the book of Ruth until what we call the 5 scrolls section, which is near the end of the writings, the end of the entire Old Testament, the order that Jews have. And we like to think of it as chronological order, but clearly it's not. Your chronological order is much closer in that regard to putting Ruth, because it's
Right,
a much older book.
because Ruth sets us up for
Ruth is traditionally an ancestor of King David.
Right, exactly,
Yeah.
and that's
All
where
more
like
so.
the book of Samuel is that kind of is setting up King David, and that's why they decided to put Ruth beforehand, because it's kind of the bridge between the judges into the kingship. That's why they put Ruth kind of in that in the middle.
And that makes actually a lot more sense than the Jewish version of chronology. Okay. However, we also know once we get past the prophets into the writing section, and I think this is the case of the writings and history section of the Protestant order, the chronology isn't accurate.
Right. Well, and then one thing that I because Job is kind of like one of those books that's kind of thrown in.
It's in our writing section. Yeah.
Right, and it's same with us. Though I would say, like, while it is written poetically, there is because it's thought to have been at least composed or compiled by Moses, which is
Interesting.
right,
Okay.
and it was from his time when he was in exile, when he ran away from Egypt. Is that he was actually he was around that area where Job lived, because and Job was not a peer, but he was kind of the same generation as like Abraham and stuff.
Oh, interesting.
Right, and so so that whole story takes place because there's no mention of the temple, Mosaic law, none of that
That's a fair
stuff.
point, yeah.
And so, and I do believe that it was while written poetically, was a real story that happened. Although we do obviously have the interaction between God and Satan in there, but the whole story of of Job's story, that I believe that took place, and if we're going chronologically, I would have put that somewhere maybe after, the somewhere after the Torah, because you don't want to break
After
up
the
the
5 books
Pentateuch,
of
because
Moses,
those are supposed to be together.
But clearly, and even given that what you just said, and I've never heard that interpretation from a Jewish source.
No, I'm not. Now, I'm
I'd
probably
have to
not
look it
in the.
up to see
I'm
if
not.
it's-
Maybe not in the majority in that. But I think there's good, at least as far as good evidence that it's a possibility.
Okay.
And I mean, I'm not alone in that. I'm not just bringing that out of thin air, but
No, that's fascinating, and you're not wrong in terms of the narrative itself of the Book of Job. But regardless of that, clearly the Jewish sources of the order of the Old Testament and the Protestant order both puts it near the end.
yeah.
Puts it in the writing section, which for us is the last third, and
Right, and as far as the
It's near
order
the-
of which prophets are first, which ones are
Right.
I
We
know
try
that's
to
a
go
little bit
in
different,
chronological
but
order. That's a little different. The
because there is some that do have historical occurrences within them. They're a mixture of historical narrative and prophetical literature.
Right.
Like Daniel, obviously, is a huge one.
Right, and at the same time,
which
we
is also
put
has
that
the giant
much later
like
than it actually happened.
that also has the largest Aramaic
Component,
component
yes.
to it.
Yes.
I think there's one other, Esther has a little bit.
Esther has quite a bit, and we know that from finding the Dead Sea Scrolls, if you're talking about any actual historical comparison to the original order of the Bible, Esther is near the end, but it's not at the end. And yet, of all they found of the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are references to every single book of the Bible, certainly of the Old Testament, I should say, except for Esther. They never found any selections of Esther in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and what do they think that means? That it was written, and if it happened much later than the rest of the Old Testament, and much later than where it's put into the Old Testament.
Yeah, that's definitely a book where I think that there is a lot of debate that goes on. I tend to believe that it was put there for a reason by people who are a heck of a lot smarter than I am, scholarly, and it does have a lot of good elements. I do believe it was a real story that happened.
I probably think it did too.
Because I mean, that's where you get the Purim is
Exactly.
where
As
that,
a matter of fact, it's considered a much more prominent, important book in Judaism than many others in the writing section, because it's associated, most of those books of the writing section, many of them I should say, are associated with a holiday, but that
Right.
was put there later. They were matched up just in the way that those 54 portions were matched up to a specific week of the year every year, in the same week. But Esther, it's the holiday that came out of the story, not the other way around. And part of the reason, in my opinion, and many Jewish scholars, that it was put where it was because there's an interesting, here's your Bible trivia of the day, that the book of Esther is the only one in the entire Old Testament where God is mentioned not at all.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, I was
God
just
is
going to
not
say
mentioned.
that.
God's mentioned 0 times. And not only that, but at the end of the book of Esther, the people of Persia, of Jewish Persia at the time, create their own holiday, which we as Jews still celebrate today. The holiday is called Purim. We celebrate it in early spring or even late winter. And it's, to put it plainly, our version of Halloween, but it's also a very kind of fun, lively story, and it's based exactly on what the Book of Esther, narrative is. And at the end of the book, those people, because they've been saved by saved from a Hitler type character at the time who was trying to wipe out
All the
entire
Jews.
Jewish population of Persia.
That's a common narrative.
It is a common narrative,
like, wipe out the Jews.
even in the Old Testament, and especially in modern, writings. And so the people, without God declaring this a holiday, holiday, when you think of it by definition, is a holy day. Okay, it's word of God type of thing. But no, in this case, just the community themselves declare this a holiday to be celebrated every year, and in Judaism, it still is.
Yeah. Well, and see, for me,
That's what the Book of Esther is
while God is his name is never mentioned in the book, you can see his providence throughout the entire narrative, because there was a lot of stuff where it's like, all these, chance encounters and all that stuff. And
there's clearly a lot of, like probably in any book of the Old Testament, any narrative anyway, there's a lot of fasting, a lot of people fasting in the story. Why are they fasting if not to give praise to the divine in a way and
Exactly.
to hope that their
Well,
prayers are answered, whatever they are praying for. In this case, they're praying just to stay alive.
Yeah, maybe Esther is more of a off-brand kind of story, because you have the stories where God shows his tremendous might and dominion over everything.
Yep.
But then he put they put they up had the story of Esther, a part of the Bible, to show that God, even though you don't see him, he still is moving through everyday events and everyday people.
And on the other side, it teaches the Jewish people a very valuable lesson that has probably kept us alive as much as anything throughout the centuries and millennia. You got to take care of yourself. And it teaches the Jews, because in the story of Esther, the Jewish community of Persia was not saved by a miracle or by God in any way.
They saved
by
themselves.
Yeah, they saved themselves.
And the other thing when it comes to Esther is, it was because it's kind of questionable how religious Esther really was, because
Very much
she
so.
was
It's
she
unclear.
was wasn't her and her what was it, her uncle?
Mordecai.
Yeah, Mordecai.
Uncle.
They were kind of
Yeah,
questionable
uncle.
as far as their
Her uncle, yeah.
religious observance, because obviously they're not in Israel anymore. They're
Right.
not, and there's a lot of people where people are surprised, like, oh, no one really knew that Esther was a Jew, which is kind of the exact opposite of the point of being a Jew, because it's being set apart.
Yep.
So there is a lot of that, and at the time, 'cause this is at least in
we think
our
it's
tradition.
around 3rd century BC.
Well, right. Well, no, but I'm
it's
saying as far
unclear.
as the setting.
yeah.
Well, it's because
Jewish
our tradition,
Persia,
we would say
modern-day
that it's like
Iran,
right
basically.
around the time they were coming back from exile is when. A lot of people were thinking
Babylonian
like, oh,
exile,
well,
exactly. Yep.
we had all this time where we weren't observing,
Mm-hmm.
and I think it's kind of telling that, well, look, there was a bunch of these non-observant Jews, and God still kind of, while his name is never mentioned, because
Mm-hmm.
they weren't necessarily worshiping him, that it's like, hey, God still is looking out for you.
Yep.
And I think that's also kind of a telling story for Christians too. It's like, just because you're going through a time and or whatever, there's God's still out there looking at you.
I think that's a good way to kind of begin our wrap-up segment, in that, going back again as we digressed away from the question of the Bible, both interpreting the Bible but also interpreting how Jews specifically look at the Bible. There's the levels of what actually separates besides what you wear, and how specifically you follow the traditions, customs, and laws. What separates an Orthodox Jew from a conservative Jew from a Reformed Jew? It's probably how you look at the Bible. Okay,
Is that what the kind of
Orthodox
separates you
Jews,
guys?
That is probably as simple as any separation. Orthodox Jews look at the Bible as divine. Conservative Jews in general, again within a range, conservative Jews look at the Bible as either divinely inspired or at least inspirational. Either by Moses, and this is where the more traditional conservative, Jews, more observant among this range, differ from the less observant, and I'm probably in the middle. Whether it's written by Moses, this Moses figure, or is written about him later on, it's still kind of divinely inspired and inspirational. We can use it for our lives today. Reformed Jews mostly view the Bible as just a narrative, a story, a fairy tale for the most part.
Okay. But do they still do all the other observances?
But they do whatever observances they choose to. Okay.
So they're just they're the loosey goosey, whatever
they're
they
the
feel like.
So
loosey-goosey,
they're
but-
the buffet Jews.
The buffet Jews.
Yeah.
And conservative Jews, it's not to say we're not the buffet Jews, but we will often, I call ourselves the loophole Jews. So we will find and exploit any loophole in the Bible or any liturgical writing that we can exploit to follow Judaism, honor Judaism, yes, but follow it and observe it in the ways we feel like following it and
Right.
observing it. Yeah.
Right.
I see. So that's kind of the main difference is the level of observance and how you feel about Scripture itself.
It all comes from and all comes back to the Bible, to Scripture, the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh. It really does.
I would say that's fairly similar to us too, because there are people who are very like hyper literal, or the Catholicism. That's a whole different issue because there's a whole hierarchy, bureaucracy of that. To me, yeah, there's a whole lot of other issues when it comes to that.
The fact that you either cannot or at least are not supposed to converse with God directly has always struck me as weird, and that's, of course,
Right.
Catholic, you have an intermediary. Rabbis, some people think this, rabbis are not intermediaries. Rabbis are more or less the equivalent of the Protestant reverend or pastor, okay? Man of the cloth, yes. Clergy, yes. Intermediary between you and God,
Right,
no.
yeah.
There's no
there
intermediary
is
among
like
Judaism, no.
there is kind of like we are as far as Christianity goes. There is it's not just a lone person like dealing with that stuff. Obviously, I might tell Andy, hey, I'm struggling with this, and like let's pray about it. But he's not my intermediary. Like I don't see him that way. We see Jesus Christ as the intermediary. He's the high priest. He's the one that is. He is God, but he is also kind of our pathway to being able to talk to God. He is our priest,
and
in a sense.
because in Jewish tradition the Messiah hasn't come yet, okay, that's the big difference that we haven't said in over 2 hours, but I think it goes without saying. Okay,
What?
Oh my God, we're still waiting. Holy moly, we're still waiting. Okay, because the Messiah hasn't come yet, that same level of, I will say, communal praying, it's stated differently, but it's often similar in that even if you are a rabbi, there are certain prayers in certain large parts of the worship service that you're not supposed to do alone. That as Jews, rabbi, clergy or not, or observant or not, you're actually supposed to only do in groups of 10, what we call a minyan, okay? And not exact groups of 10 or more, okay? So
He said it, Jews are minions.
You heard it here, folks.
And yes, spelled differently, but yeah, the word is a minyan, which means a group of 10 in the old Hebrew word that it comes from.
He admitted it.
Yep. Jews are, mea culpa, I'm sorry. So, in that communal prayer, which even that phrase communal prayer is a little bit weird to the ears of a Jew, because the whole concept of let's pray together or I'm going to pray for you is kind of not taboo, but it's
Not regular.
It's not regular in Judaism.
Right.
But it's not evil by any means.
Right.
I'll pray with you because we do pray together. We are mandated in certain prayers to have 10 people around us where we're praying the same prayers together, but we're still praying ourselves and we're praying individually. Prayer is a much more, in general, individual concept in Judaism than it is in Christianity as a
Right.
whole. Okay.
Well, and that's also that's also a very one of those issues within Christianity too, that everyone's a little bit confused about, like, how do I pray? Where do I pray? When do I pray? Who do I pray with? So there's a lot of that.
That's a whole thing in Judaism too, and if you're observant, you learn that from an early age and you observe it every single day, 3 times a day. You actually have 3 separate prayer services a day in addition to whatever else.
Right.
And that's every day, not just every Sabbath, but every day of the week.
And then because it's not an easy issue, to say the least, and it's something that a lot of Christians wrestle with themselves. But yeah, no, it's interesting the differences for Judaism, like what you were saying is like, oh well, it's April 10th. It's like we know exactly
what section of the Bible we're going to read, what part of, and not just what part of the Old Testament we're going to read.
Right.
Or sorry, I should say not just what part of the Torah we're going to read, but what selection of either the prophets or the writing sections of the Old Testament we're going to read. Okay.
Right.
So what portion, what number of the 54, and we have names for each of the portions. I think if you asked a rabbi, unless this rabbi has specifically studied it, you say, what's portion 35 out of 54? He would have no idea. But you could ask him, name the portions in order, and if it's a rabbi, he'd probably know all 54 in order, which 10 or 11 or 12 are from Genesis, which 10, 11, or 12 are from Exodus, etc. If you name a portion, I am learned enough, also because I teach it to youth and adults. If I gave you a list of the 54 portions, and you selected one at random, I could tell you which of the 5 books of Moses it's from. I could do a decent job of telling you the 54 in order off the top of my head. I'd probably miss 2 or 3 here and 2 or 3 there. So that's where I am, as what I call, a scholarly Jew. But regardless, even, the average and probably the more knowledgeable than average rabbi could not tell you this verse is from Leviticus chapter 29, verse 7. No. Because
you have your own way of
divisions, those 54 portions, we have our own way, and those 54 are tied weekly to the Sabbath readings.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, what I was saying is you guys know exactly what given day, what scripture you're going to be reading that day.
We are very scheduled.
Right. Whereas, even within the same denomination,
even within different denominations. Oh yeah, you're saying.
I'm saying
Christians.
even within the same denomination, I could go to another church of the same denomination, completely different teaching that day.
That's something I didn't know for sure, but was wondering.
Because
so different Methodist churches, for example,
right. So it's
might have different biblical readings on the Sabbath.
So you have, and it's all mainly based off of whoever the pastor is. They might be going through different sermon series as far as we're gonna break down the book of John, one of the Gospel of John,
right.
And then they're gonna be doing that for a couple months. Whereas some other person, it's oh yeah, we do different topical ones and and so they'll use. I don't necessarily know how I feel about that. I'm one of those guys. I like to, because to me context is so important. And so when if you're very serious about studying scripture, it's let's take a look at the whole chunk, because we could look at this one passage, but this one passage that we're looking at, if we're not looking at what came before and what's coming after, we may be getting it wrong.
In terms of context, I think the Jewish way of doing things, in terms of scheduling those biblical readings, would both delight and annoy you at the same time, because not only are the 54 portions of the Torah divided weekly, but each of them are paired, and this happened around the same time, around 1,000 years ago again. Each of those 54 portions are paired with a selection from one of the books of the prophets, specifically in our middle section of the Old Testament, of the Hebrew Bible. So the prophets, which are just these prophets, so not including Ruth, for example, that's a different holiday-only reading, not a Sabbath reading. The prophets are the same things. The books of the prophets are Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and then Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and what we call the 12. And the 12 are those 12, what the Jews call minor prophets, and I think the minor prophets are the same, give or take one, and it's Hosea, Amos, Joel, all those interesting ones, Zechariah, Habakkuk, Zephaniah.
All those fun names.
Yeah. There's all those fun names. Those are the 12 minor prophets, okay?
Yeah.
And basically minor because they wrote less than Isaiah.
Not less in stature, but less in...
Right.
Yeah.
And not even less, we often
quantity,
mistake and call them the
stature.
latter prophets, which is not necessarily true chronologically.
Right,
Hosea
it's not.
is very old as Jeremiah and Isaiah. But it's just less writing. And the famous, it has both the Book of Prophets has the longest and the shortest book in the entire Hebrew Bible, in the entire Old Testament. It has Isaiah with its 66 chapters and Obadiah with a page. With its one chapter.
A paragraph.
The entire book of Obadiah is a one-chapter book.
It's like a paragraph.
Yeah, and we do read that once a year. And we call them, those selections from the books of the prophets, we call them Haftorahs.
Okay.
Which basically means half Torahs. Why? Because there's that 54 portions. So why I asked before on the average number of chapters per book, if you divide that by, 10, then you're talking about 3 to 4 chapters or of Torah, of Pentateuch, is what we read on every Sabbath, and we might skip around those 3 to 4 chapters, but it'll if you're Orthodox, you'll read all those 4 chapters on average, 3 to 4. Okay, you might skip around them a little bit, but you'll certainly study, the bulk of the entire of those 3 to 4 chapters on average. But then there's a selection of, it can be half a chapter, it can be 2.5, or even a long one is 4 chapters of a Haftorah.
Right.
And it doesn't have to be chapters 1 through 4 or 5 through 8.
It'd just be a random selection
it can
from...
start halfway through chapter 26 and end halfway through chapter 28. It often does. And that's the contextual thing.
Right.
Which you have, this prophet, and most of them are from Isaiah. Why? Because
it's the longest.
It's the longest and it has the most, right.
The most meat.
The most meat. So, and there's a lot from Jeremiah is the second most common, and Ezekiel and Hosea are the third or fourth most common.
That would both delight and frustrate the heck out of me because... One, you're getting a lot of meat as far as scripture goes, and you're reading that many chapters at once.
Yeah.
But then, to break up, another portion, it's like, oh, come
so
on.
What it's for is for context, yes, but also comparison of, hey, this prophet was writing, especially if the prophet is Isaiah or Jeremiah, are writing about the oncoming destruction of the first temple.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, what we just read in Torah are the Jews are revolting, and it's like the golden calf incident, for example.
Oh, okay.
Because the Jews
all right.
are revolting throughout, after the Exodus, for example, mainly. They're always, revolting or angry at Moses, angry at God, complaining. They're complaining all the time through the 40 years in the desert.
We want to be slaves
the
again.
books of
We at least
Leviticus
had
and Numbers
food.
are about. Exactly. And so it's saying, okay, well, here's another time, approximately 500 years later, that the Jews are complaining. And guess what happens? The first temple is going to be destroyed because of it. So here's a lesson to you, okay.
That makes sense.
That's what I mean by contextual comparison. Yeah. That's why we compare and pair the prophets to the Torah that we do.
Okay. Well, one last topic before we end this, because we are a little
we're
bit...
at 2.25 hours.
Yeah,
Pretty good.
so we...
if you've survived all of this, jerks, I commend you, and you are now considered a fellow Jew.
Yeah. so
we're
you
all
want to be
getting
a
our
Jew,
card.
huh?
We're all getting
Everyone's
our Jew card
getting their
today.
Jew card,
Yeah.
yes.
So I think one thing that always kind of interests me, because you have obviously in the and was it Leviticus? It talks about all the different sin offerings and all the different
what we call the sacrifices.
Yeah, the sacrifice, all the different types of sacrifices, and obviously that.
What happened to those?
Well,
that's a great
here's because for one, in Christianity, we see that a completion of that through Jesus Christ. He was the ultimate sacrifice that he compiles all of those sacrifices within himself.
And
he
because
is the,
of that,
he
you
is
don't
the,
need to observe
right.
and actually do those sacrifices.
Right,
Oh,
so
see, I
he
didn't
is
know
the
that specific
perfect
thing.
sacrifice.
Okay.
That is why we no longer observe those sacrifices.
Because
you know, he-
customs about the unblemished and the perfect.
Yep.
Right, and it's
the red heifer. One of
so
my
one of
favorites.
his lines that is quoted is that it's I didn't come to I didn't come to destroy the law. I came to fulfill the law. And that's so we see a lot of what we read about. It's not we don't just throw it away because it still needs to be read.
Yeah.
But we see it as it's kind of Jesus Christ completed all of this within himself.
Okay.
And so, but in the case of Judaism,
What's our excuse? He asked.
yeah, no. So obviously,
great question, and a pretty simple answer.
But
actually.
if we're looking just straight Old Testament, before Jesus was there. Obviously, those sacrifices require the temple, or
bingo. You answered the question before I could.
Right. So, but obviously, you guys still, take those laws very seriously. How do you deal with that?
How do we deal with that? Okay. So, in short, and it is at least a shorter answer than most of my rambling.
Because it all goes back to sin in the end. What do you guys do as far as
what do we
dealing
do
with
in
that?
terms of that? Okay. So two major things about the sacrifices.
Right.
One,
Because I have Jesus. What do you got? What's
What do
yours?
we I have Jesus. What about you?
Yeah.
Okay. We have prayer.
Okay.
Our prayers, and what I mean is the literal worship service, not random, please God, let me or my family
Right, you
do
have
this.
very like strict, like these
strict
are like
worship service.
yeah, like
Okay.
a strict prayers that you recite.
And those prayers are, I said
Essentially
the,
like
the prayer
creeds,
book.
essentially.
Yeah. What is our prayer book called? It's called in Hebrew the Siddur. What does Siddur mean? Order. Okay, it's all in an order, and it's all in the same order again for about 1,000 years, if not more than that. This is the prayer book, mind you. Okay, so and you can add and subtract prayers, especially if you're a rabbi. It's an easy thing to do. If you're a less observant Jew, it's an easy thing to do too. Even if you're an Orthodox Jew, the rabbis are allowed to add and subtract prayers, because we understand that these prayer books were made not 2,000 or 3,000 years ago with the Torah and the Old Testament, but 1,000 years ago made by rabbis, and so they can be changed and unmade by current rabbis. Okay.
Okay.
I see.
But that Siddur, that order, prayer book, is not each of those prayers have replaced one sacrifice specifically, but the whole group of prayers has replaced the whole group of sacrifices. Most of the sacrifices, I want to say, have to do with different holidays, specific times of the year.
Right.
Okay, and the traditions of those holidays have kind of taken the place, not specifically replaced the sacrifices, but they've just kind of taken the place of the sacrifices. And the other thing, even if they don't, we study the sacrifices, but believe it or not, and it's not hard to believe, it's one of the less studied portions of the Old Testament of the Torah is the Leviticus sacrifice sections. And actually, there's a whole nother section in Numbers about, I'm going to say, 3/4 of the way through Numbers, getting near the end of Numbers. There's all the holiday sections of sacrifices for holidays, and they're all specific. One turtle dove and one yearling ram and one bull.
Yeah.
Okay.
I read it. It's like, man, this is
It's a long list.
this is intense.
That's why they call it Numbers in English. Okay.
Right.
Combination. There's a bunch of censuses taken during the 40 years of wandering, but it's also just the whole numbers and the whole heavy. This number of animals of this type and this number of animals of that type are sacrificed. And obviously they're not all animals. A lot of it are burnt offerings and incense. Okay, you're just sacrificing herbs. Okay, only I say half of them, but in reality it's probably like 1/10 of them are animals. They couldn't afford animals. They knew that.
Too
okay?
expensive.
Right.
Yeah.
Let alone
Well, that's why they
bulls.
had like in some of those
Most of those
offerings where
sacrifices-
like they would have like
The
for
offerings, they do eat the
they would have
the
like the
bulls,
wealthy
too.
where
Okay.
they would have like the bulls.
Yes.
Whereas like
It goes
but if you're
down
like
to
poor,
turtle
they'd have
doves.
turtle doves or like
Bingo.
yeah.
Bingo. Or if you couldn't do that, herbs, vegetation.
Right.
And so it's just the other big part, besides that prayer has replaced them. The other big part is we can't anymore because several times, not every single line, but several times in the Old Testament under those sacrifice sections, it says this is what the high priest was sacrificing in the temple. And so by that we interpret, pretty
so
much
it's like a
all of
little-
these sacrifices, even if it doesn't say it, were done at the temple, by the temple, on behalf of every Jew in the community in the world, and we have no temple anymore. So therefore,
no high priest that's
and no priests at
sending
all.
the way for
Right.
that.
Right, we have the descendants. Next, I won't get into it today because it's another long discussion topic, but maybe an episode of the podcast down the road we'll talk about how there are actually so-called descendants of the priestly class still alive, and there's many thousands of among Jews.
Yeah.
There's many thousands of, according to our family names,
Like
who we
Levi and
consider
Cohen.
The Cohens and the Levites. Cohens are, in short, the descendants of Aaron, the high priest, in the priestly class. Levites are descendants of Moses, supposedly. Okay? And maybe one day in the future, DNA testing will kind of show that that's true. What it has already shown is that most people with the name Cohn, Cohen, are all related, much more closely related than the average Jew is related to the next Jew.
That's
and the same
fascinating.
with people with the last names of Levi, Levin, Siegel, which is a Levite name from an old anagram. The L of Siegel means Levi. Those Jews are all more closely related than the average Jew.
That is fast. Well, we'll definitely have to have you on for another
Yep.
Jew discussion
Yep.
because I'm very fascinated by the whole thing and learning about the differences and yeah, this is one of those that
There's endless discussion.
yeah.
We've been discussing it for 25 years, and we still get a kick out of discussing it and get to new things every time we have a talk.
Yeah, I mean, we could go on for hours with this stuff. This is stuff that gets me
But
excited.
please don't, because I have to edit this.
I know. Well, we're not. We're gonna end.
We're getting antsy, and we know you are, jerks.
And so, anyways, I just want to thank you, Dan, for coming on and talking about your faith and the differences. And thank you for being a great friend too. We'll have you on again.
My pleasure.
And so, anyways, that's the end of the episode for this month or this week or however.
Whenever the hell I feel like getting into this.
Yeah,
episode.
whenever Andy feels like getting up off his ass and doing something.
This period of ass getting off.
Yeah. But anyways, want to thank you guys for tuning in. A little bit of a different episode today. Kind of like more of my own interest that I wanted to share with you guys. And hopefully you learned something. I certainly did. And we hope that you'll tune in again soon for the next episode. Until then, check out our previous episodes. We have a whole library of great guests that have come on. And we have our live stream, Nocturnal Transmissions. That comes out every Tuesday at 8 p.m.-ish. Yeah, sometimes we have some scheduling issues. But Tuesday, Nocturnal Transmissions. We got our classic movie reviews that we give you every week. Various topics that are going on in the news, or just regular what the hell we feel like talking about. There's also Up by Up Down, which is on a little bit of a hiatus, but if you want to go back and watch me play old video games, we have a significant number of episodes in the library, and eventually we're going to get back to that soon. There'll be a new format for that, but yeah, check out the old episodes. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, hit that bell notification so you get notified if when we have new episodes coming out or clips that we put out through the week. Our Instagram is at podcastcoj. Is that correct, Andy?
No, at Circle of Jerks.
Circle
Podcast.
of Jerks podcast. That's the Twitter is at podcastcoj. Hit us up on those. We'll follow you back. We'll talk to you. All that good stuff. And until next time, see you later.
Deuces.
Peace.
Wait, don't move.